One night, 4 young brothers were sleeping in their bedroom in their little house in Tennessee when they started to hear what sounded like a rat gnawing on one of their bedposts. So the 2 oldest brothers climbed out of their bed to go find this rat, but the second their feet touched the wooden floor, the gnawing sound stopped. The boys checked the room, they checked the bedpost, there was no sign of any rat, and so eventually, the 2 oldest brothers just kind of shrugged it off and got back in bed. But when they closed their eyes again, the gnawing sound filled the room again. Except this time, it was louder and more frantic. Little did they know, these sounds were just the beginning of a multi-year-long nightmare that they and the rest of their family would have to endure. Their terrifying story is known as the Bell Witch Haunting, and it's considered to be one of the most frightening documented hauntings of all time. And today, I'm going to share their story with you. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please ungold the Amazon Music follow button's Goldfish crackers. Okay, let's get into today's story. In 1804, a man named John Bell decided his farm in North Carolina was just too small for his growing family. So he, along with his wife Lucy and their 6 kids, packed all their belongings onto wagons and then traveled more than 600 miles west to this 1,000-acre patch along the Red River in northern Tennessee. The area they settled was known as Robertson County, and at the time, it was very rural and basically nobody lived there. And so the Bell family, when they arrived in Robertson County, fully expected to have to work with the few families that were there to build up the settlement. Basically, they wanted to build a town from scratch. But this was the kind of work that John Bell was born for. He was raised on a farm where he had a reputation for working extremely hard and never giving up. John was very generous and excellent at working with other people. In fact, when his family was still in North Carolina, John and his very gentle and sweet wife Lucy would open their door to anybody who needed a place to stay or a hot meal, and sometimes John would just give money to his neighbors when he felt like they were down on hard times. So, after arriving in Robertson County and after the Bell family had met their few neighbors, John Bell got right to work. First, he began clearing trees off of his land, and then with that lumber, he built a 1.5-story log house up on this hill not far from the Red River. And in fact, the Red River was a very popular picnic spot and fishing spot for the few people that lived in Robertson County, and so in virtue of the Bell's house being so near the river, the Bell family was always running into their neighbors and saying hi and making friends. And so it wasn't long after John and his family had arrived and built this house that the Bell family became one of the most popular families in the area. And for many years, the Bell family lived a very happy and prosperous life in Robertson County. Most mornings, John would wake up first, and then he would rouse the children, who would then leave the house and walk through the nearby woods to go to their school, and then they'd come back before sunset. And then while the kids were at school during the day, John and his older sons would go out and work the land or help build structures around town to build the settlement up, or they would build the boats that they would use to transport the tobacco and meats they produced on their farm down south for trade. John and Lucy would have 3 more kids while in Robertson County, and before long, their oldest children began getting married and starting families of their own and building their own houses nearby. But one summer day in 1817, so 13 years after the Bell family first arrived in Robertson County, John would have a very strange experience that at the time he would completely write off. But years later, they would look back and say, that's when it started. On that summer day in 1817, John was by himself. He was out walking through his cornfield near his house when he looked out and he saw this big dog just sitting in the middle of the cornfield. Now, there were lots of dogs around Robertson County, so it wasn't unusual to run into a dog while you were out and about. but there was something off about this dog. It almost looked misshapen, like its bones had broken many times over and reset at awkward angles. And this dog just looked way too big to be a dog. It almost looked more like a big wolf. And this dog was staring at John in a very human way, not breaking eye contact, staring right at John. Now, John was not someone who easily spooked, but standing in this cornfield staring at this dog who was staring right back at him, John couldn't help but feel totally unsettled and a little bit panicked. And so John, who had his rifle with him, raised it and fired in the direction of this dog, and when he did, the dog took off running. And so John, he watched as this dog galloped away from him and disappeared into the tree line of the forest far away, and once the dog was totally out of view, John marched forward to the spot in the cornfield where this dog had been sitting. And when he got there, he was expecting to see the corn kind of pressed down from where this big animal had been sitting, but it wasn't. There was no sign that any big creature had been sitting right there. And as he looked around him, he saw there were no paw prints, no tracks on the ground, either coming to this spot or going in the direction that he watched this big dog run off. John was totally confused by this, but after sitting there kind of wondering how this could be, he just told himself, you know what, I'm overthinking this. It was just some big ugly dog and a missed shot. This is no big deal. And so John promptly turned around and walked back to his house, forgetting all about the dog. But not long after John saw this dog in the cornfield, his family began experiencing other strange things back at their house. At night, after the Bell family had climbed into bed, they would start hearing a knocking sound on the side of their house. And as soon as they got up to go inspect it, the knocking would stop. And then they'd lay back down again, and they would hear it again, except it was coming from another side of the house. It was like there was someone or something outside of their house just kind of circling around them, periodically knocking on their walls. Now, John was convinced this was not the work of some animal. This was a person, a prankster, and they were hiding out in the woods somewhere. And so he instructed his family not to mention the tapping sounds to anybody in town because he thought somebody in town was doing this to them, and he didn't want them to know that they were onto them. He wanted these pranksters to come back and do it again so he could catch them in the act. But over the course of several weeks, the tapping continued, and every time John would lay in wait and try to run out and see who was there, there'd be no one. And there'd be no tracks anywhere around the house indicating that anyone had ever been there. And as unsettling as these knocking sounds were for the family, they were nothing compared to the things that happened next. One Sunday night in May of 1818, so roughly 1 year after John had seen that big dog in the cornfield and a couple of months after the knocking on the walls had begun in the Bell's household, 4 of John's sons were asleep in their bedroom inside of their home when they woke up to the sound of what sounded like a rat gnawing on one of their bedposts. Now, these boys were sleeping in 2 bunk beds, and the 2 oldest brothers were sleeping on the lower bunk. And so they instinctively got up, stepped onto the floor to go find this rat, but the second they stepped onto the floor, the gnawing sound completely disappeared. The 2 boys searched the room for this rat, they couldn't find it, and when they checked all of the bedposts, there was no sign that any of them had been gnawed on. So the 2 older brothers finally just kind of shrugged it off and climbed back in bed. The moment they closed their eyes, the gnawing sound began again. Except now it was louder and more frantic, like whatever was under there was desperately trying to chew through the wood of their beds. But again, when the 2 older brothers leapt out of their bed to go find whatever animal was doing this, the sound would completely stop and the room would go still. The boys searched the room again. There was no sign of any rat or any animal. There were no marks on the underside of their beds, and so they had no idea what to make of this. The gnawing sounds would continue all that night, making it nearly impossible for these boys to sleep, and it would happen again the next night the same way. But on the night after that, so the 3rd night, the boys heard a new sound in their room. As they're laying in their beds, exhausted from barely sleeping the last 2 nights, they began hearing what sounded like someone gasping for air underneath their beds. Like they were being choked, they were gulping and smacking their lips and clawing at the underside of the beds. The 2 oldest boys were terrified, but eventually worked up the courage and leapt from their bed to confront whatever was underneath them. But again, as soon as their feet hit the floor, the sounds completely stopped and the room went still. But this time, the boys were so frightened, they decided not to try to just go back to sleep. Instead, they woke up the rest of their family, and the Bell family searched the entire house, top to bottom, looking for any indication of what could have been making those sounds. But there was nothing in their house. There was no marks from some animal or rat. I mean, there was no indication that anything was other than normal. Now, to this point, the Bell family had not told anybody in town about either the knocking sounds on the walls, or the rat gnawing sounds, or now the gulping for air sounds. And a part of that was because John had told the family, don't tell anyone because we're going to catch whoever's doing this. But another part of it was the family knew as soon as they brought this stuff up, they could be the target of ridicule because people wouldn't believe them. But after this night with the gulping and gasping sounds, the Bell kids really could not sleep anymore. They were just up all night, terrified. And so finally, John went to one of his neighbors who he was very close with and confided in him that something weird was happening inside of his house. Now, John was not the kind of person who made things up. He was very straightforward, very honest. He didn't even tell jokes. And so this neighbor, as he's listening to this unbelievable story, just takes John at face value and says, you know what? I'll stay the night in your house and I'll see if I can hear all these strange sounds. That night, the neighbor would stay with John Bell and his family in the Bell household, and sure enough, the neighbor would hear the tapping on the walls, he would hear the rat gnawing on the wood post in the boys' room, as well as that gasping and gulping sound coming from the boys' room, and this neighbor was so terrified that he did not last the night in John's house. He left in the middle of the night to go back to his house. After this, word spread quickly around Robertson County about what was happening at the Bell household, and the way the townspeople reacted was very supportive. I mean, the Bell family had been instrumental in building up the settlement, and John and his wife Lucy were so kind and generous, and so the townspeople decided that they were going to find a way to rally around the Bell family and try to help them. So other people in town began volunteering to spend the night inside of the Bell household with the Bell family. One, because they wanted the Bell family to feel some security, having some more people around them. And 2, these people were thinking that maybe just their presence inside of the Bell household would scare off whoever or whatever was tormenting the Bells. But no matter who stayed inside of the Bell household, the noises persisted every single night. Townspeople came up with all sorts of explanations for what was happening to the Bell family, ranging from, John's youngest daughter must be behind this because she wants attention, or other people said maybe there's a family or an individual that hates the Bell family and they're targeting them and they're behind this. There was even a theory that someone in town had learned ventriloquism, which is a kind of performance where the ventriloquist throws their voice so it sounds like it's coming from somewhere else, not from their body. And so the idea was this ventriloquist was just a prankster and they were screwing with the Bell family. But the townspeople searched the Bell's house with the Bell family over and over again, and they never found any sign of what could be making these noises. The people in town even went so far as to have people watch each member of the Bell family as they slept at night to make sure none of them were responsible for these sounds. And sure enough, as the Bell family was being closely monitored, the noises would start, and it was very clearly not coming from anyone in the Bell family. As the months went on, and the Bell family was forced to endure whatever was going on inside of their home, the people in town started to notice something odd about John Bell. Normally, John was a very engaged person, that when he spoke to you, he was locked onto you and really paying attention. But at some point, after these mysterious things began happening at his house, John would be talking to someone, and then suddenly his eyes would kind of gloss over and his jaw would go slack, and it would look like he was staring off into the distance. And then his face would start to twitch. And at first, these twitches were fairly minor and were centered just around his eyes. But over time, these twitches became much more dramatic, to the point where his jaw would start to kind of quiver up and down, and his eyes would begin blinking out of sync. And then, when the twitching finally stopped, John, without saying a word to the person he had just been talking to, would just wander back to his house. He'd go up to his bedroom, and he would sit on his bed for hours and hours and hours, just staring at the wall, not eating, not drinking, not saying anything. The Bell family felt like they were hostages in their own home. They had no idea what was causing these things to happen or why they were happening, and they were all filled with this constant sense of dread. As for the townspeople, most of them had come to believe that whatever was happening to the Bell family was likely caused by their neighbor, Kate Batts. Kate was known to be very eccentric and kind of unpleasant, and she was known to be fairly unlucky, because her husband had become disabled and her 3 kids had all died young. Kate also had this strange habit of using really big, complex words in her conversations, but she misused the words, and so everything she said kind of sounded off. Townspeople would talk about Kate Batts' witch, and they started referring to whatever was causing these strange phenomenon at the Bell household as just Kate. However, when Kate found out about this, she was totally offended and said she had nothing to do with whatever was happening to the Bells. By September of 1820, the terrifying happenings at the Bell household had been going on for 3 years, and somehow the Bell family had just learned to live with it. However, John Bell was not doing good. It was like the longer these strange things were happening, the more and more John seemed to become a shell of his former self. His sudden dazes and twitching fits began to happen more and more frequently, and the time he would spend afterwards sitting in his bedroom staring at the wall in silence would go on longer and longer and longer. In private, John would tell his wife, Lucy, that he believed someone or something was torturing him to death. And then one day, as John was getting sicker and sicker, one of his daughters, Esther, left the house to go gather up some eggs in the hen house, which was across the lane from where the Bell house was. And so she left the house, she crossed over the road, she began walking up towards this hen house, and as she was walking, she heard what sounded like someone moving behind her. And so she turned around, and she saw there was this woman dressed all in black with her head down, walking slowly down the road she had just walked on towards her house. So she's basically walking exactly where Esther had just come from, but Esther had not seen her until just now. So she wasn't really sure how this woman had arrived on the road, but Esther wasn't worried. She looked at this woman, she didn't recognize her, but just assumed she was somebody from town, and that was it. And so Esther turned away from this woman and walked the rest of the way up to the hen house. She went inside, she got the eggs in her basket, and then when she came back outside again and she was back on that road, now facing in the direction of her house, she saw this woman in black with her head down was still trudging along slowly, now much closer to the Bell household. And so Esther, she began walking down the road, looking at this woman, trying to figure out who she was. And as she got closer and closer, she realized she recognized her as somebody from the village. This was a neighbor of hers. And so Esther yelled out a friendly hello. But this woman in black with her head down didn't turn around. She didn't react. She just kept on slowly walking down the lane towards the Bell house. And so Esther began walking a little bit faster, getting closer and closer to this woman, and she yelled out a few more times, "Hey, hello, how are you?" But each time, this woman in black just appeared not to hear Esther. And Esther, she's looking around, and there's nobody else out. It's just her and this woman who's now about 15 feet away from her. And so Esther starts to feel really uncomfortable about this woman. And so Esther just stops on the road and stares at the back of this woman. And the second Esther stopped, this woman who was trudging along also suddenly stopped. And then she reached up with her hands, her back is still to Esther, and she took her bonnet off of her head. A bonnet is a type of hat. And then she dropped the bonnet on the ground, and right away this woman's black matted hair kind of tumbled down over her back. And then this woman, without moving, began reaching up and stroking her hair, running her fingers through her hair as if she was trying to comb it out. And so Esther is watching this, kind of wondering what's going on here. And so Esther began walking slowly closer and closer to this woman to make sure she was okay. But with each step that Esther took towards this woman began running her hands faster and faster through her hair until it almost looked impossible. She was moving so fast. And then Esther realized with horror that she wasn't just combing her hair. This woman was grabbing clumps of her hair and pulling them out of her head. In fact, Esther could literally hear the hair being ripped from this woman's scalp. And so before long, there was hair all over the ground around this woman. And so Esther at this point is terrified. She thinks there's something wrong with this woman. And so she runs around this woman without looking at her, charges into her house, which is right in front of this lady. She goes inside, she locks the door behind her. And then Esther calls out for one of her sisters who was home and said, come here, come here. And the two of them went to the front window and they look out onto the road and they see the woman. She's still there in the same spot, ripping her hair out. But Esther makes eye contact with this woman. And the second that happens, the woman freezes. Her hands are still in her hair and she's looking directly up at Esther. And Esther and her sister, they're kind of taken aback by the way this woman is looking at them. And then this woman slowly brings her hands down and she's staring up at Esther the whole time. And then she turns suddenly and walks around the side of the property out of view of Esther and her sister. And so Esther and her sister, they shriek, they leave the front window and they run over to the side window where this woman was heading. And they saw this woman climbing up and over their fence, getting into their side property. And behind her were now 3 children who they had not seen before, just marching right behind this woman in black. And so this woman and these 3 children, in plain sight of Esther and her sister, they walk into this grove of trees on the Bell property. And so Esther and her sister, they're just staring. They have no idea what's happening. And then one by one, the woman first, then each of the children climbed their own trees. And then once all 4 of them were up in these trees, they turned around so they were all looking directly at Esther and her sister. And then they all began swaying with their bodies in the trees, getting these trees to bend and wave hard left and right. And so Esther and her sister are horrified, and as they're staring, Esther's husband just happens to come through the front door. And so Esther yells for him to come over here and look out the window, look what they're doing out there. And so Esther's husband, he runs over to the window and he looks out, but he can't see the woman or the 3 kids. He can only see trees swaying unnaturally left and right. And so Esther and her sister, they realize he's not seeing what we're seeing, what's happening. And before long, they're screaming. The husband's trying to figure out what's going on. And finally, the trio just ran from the window, went out the back door, and ran around to the side yard to go confront this woman and these children. But when they got out to the grove of trees, the woman, the kids, they were gone, and there was no tracks anywhere on the ground to indicate that anybody had been there recently. Not long after this incident, sometime in October of 1820, John Bell and one of his sons were out for a walk on their farm. And as they walked, suddenly John stopped and threw his hands up to his face as if he was protecting himself from someone trying to hit him. And then all of a sudden, John's face just went totally slack and his body began to contort into these horrible, grotesque angles and his back began to arch so far it looked like his back would break. And so John's son, he's watching this happen. He has no idea what to do. And so he just runs over and grabs his dad and tries to pull him upright. And as he does this, this horrifying shriek fills the air. John's son has no idea where it's coming from, but it's so loud it stops him in his tracks. And then as fast as all of this had happened, it all stopped. John was back to normal, laying on the ground, coming to, and the shrieking was gone. It was silent on their farm. And so John's son turns to his dad, and he sees John is crying on the ground. And he says to his son, "I don't have much time left." John's son would help him up, and then the two of them silently just walked back to the house, and John went straight to bed. A few weeks later, on the morning of December 19th, 1820, John didn't come down for breakfast, and so his family went up to his bedroom to make sure he was okay. But when they found him, he was still laying in bed, he was breathing, but no matter what they did, they couldn't wake him up. And so one of John's sons ran to the medicine cabinet inside of their house, but when he opened it up, all the medicine was gone, and in their place was this strange glass vial that contained a smoky, dark liquid that the son had never seen before and no one in the family had seen before. And so the family immediately called for a doctor to come to their house, both for John and also to see what this liquid was. And so the doctor showed up. He didn't really know what to do for John. It didn't make sense that he just was not waking up. And then the doctor checked on this liquid and he said, you need to test this on some farm animals to make sure we know what it does. And so the family went out and found a stray cat and they force-fed it some of this liquid, and within minutes, the cat had died. The Bell family swore they had not put that vial in the medicine cabinet. They had no idea what it was or how it got there. As for John, he would not wake up that day, and in fact, the following morning, when he was still in bed, he died. After John's death, the strange occurrences at the Bell household basically all came to a stop, for the most part. Some people in town reported, after John's death, seeing strange lights floating around the Bell property, and also sometimes they reported hearing a strange sing-song voice kind of coming from somewhere out around their property. John's wife, Lucy, would remain inside of that house until 1838, when she passed away. Today, there's nothing left of the Bell household. However, there is a cave on their property, an underground cave, and people swear that's where whatever tormented the Bells came from. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are not available on this podcast. They're only on YouTube. Again, the YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 spooky stories about messages from beyond. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Old Souls, and it's about a mother in China who makes a wild discovery. The second story you'll hear is called More Than a Feeling, and it's about a woman who wakes up in the middle of the night with a very strange feeling. And the third and final story you'll hear is called 1,000 Tortured Souls, and it's about a cemetery in Scotland with a very dark history. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the follow button if you can quickly use their cell phone to make a simple call to your parents. And as soon as they say yes and hand it over, immediately factory reset it and throw it off a cliff. Okay, let's get into our first story called Old Souls. One afternoon in the spring of 1990, a young mother tidied up her family's living room in Pingyang Township, which is a small rural community made up of several villages in southern China. And she was almost done when she heard her 3-year-old twin daughters start to cry. And this really caught her off guard, because even though these kids were only 3 years old and 3-year-olds cry, well, her daughters basically never cried. They were like silent all the time. The girls' names were Shi Tsai and Shi Hongwu, and they'd been really easy babies because they were basically quiet all the time and just wanted to sleep. However, as they got older, their silence became more concerning. All they really wanted to do was just lay around and sleep and do nothing. Even at 3 years old, they hadn't even said their first words yet. So, when this mom heard these girls crying, she rushed down the hall to see what was going on. 1, just obviously to make sure her kids were okay, but 2, just out of curiosity. This is so uncharacteristic to be making any noise at all. And so the mom, she burst into the nursery and she saw her girls in their crib and they were sobbing hysterically, totally upset, and the mother rushed over and she scooped them up and asked, what's going on? Are you okay? But of course the girls didn't say anything because they didn't speak. They just continued to cry. But the mom, she kind of assessed her kids and couldn't see any injuries. They didn't seem sick. They were just upset about something, but she had no idea what it was. And so the mom just stood there comforting her girls until they calmed down, and then she put them back into the crib and they both went to sleep. And that was it. A couple of days later, and the twin girls were back to their normal routine. being totally silent and sleeping for most of the day. And as the girls slept in their nursery, their mom just went around the house doing some housework, and at some point, she walked down the hallway past the girls' bedroom. Now, their door to the nursery was shut, and again, they're just sleeping and being totally quiet. The mom hasn't heard them at all day. And as she's walking down the hallway, she suddenly comes to an abrupt stop right outside the nursery door, because distinctly she can hear her girls making noise in their room. But they're making a noise that just doesn't make any sense to the mother. Her daughters were not crying or fussing or anything like that. They were talking. At first, the mother wanted to rush in there and experience this firsthand, this landmark moment of her girls speaking for the first time. But she also worried if she went in there, they might go silent and she'd ruin the moment. And so instead, she just pressed her ear to the door and just listened. And as she listened, she really couldn't believe what she was hearing. Because these girls weren't just babbling, saying random words. These girls were having like a full-blown conversation with each other, like adult-level sentences being spoken back and forth. These girls who apparently, at least according to the mother, couldn't even speak. Like, how is this even happening? However, the more the mother listened to her daughters, the more unsettled she became. Not only because, she's listening to her daughters speak for the first time at like an adult level, which is totally bizarre, but the content of this discussion her 3-year-old daughters are having made no sense. These girls were talking about stuff that they could not possibly know. The girls were talking in detail about people and events from a totally different village. A village their mother knew they had never been to, had never even heard of, and certainly didn't know anybody who lived there. Now, in basically every other part of the world, if a mother suddenly heard her 3-year-old twins, who had never said a word before, suddenly having adult-level conversations with each other about people and places that they can't possibly know about, that might be enough to spurn that mother to at least call their doctor. But this mom? Well, she lived in Pingyang Township. And that meant, when she heard what her daughters were saying, as alarming as it was, she actually did know what was going on. Pingyang Township has a very strange secret. And that secret is that of the approximately 7,000 residents who live there, over 100 claim to be the reincarnated spirits of people who have died traumatic deaths. And this is not just some wacky thing these people are saying. No, in Pingyang Township, it's not just those 100 people who believe they really are reincarnated. It's the whole community. All 7,000 some odd people 100% believe that these people truly are reincarnated. And so how that plays out is that periodically, the reincarnated folks will go to a non-reincarnated person in the township and will claim things like, hey, in my past life, your family owed me a debt, and so now you're going to pay it out. And these non-reincarnated people will absolutely pay that debt. Or in other cases, there have been fights, physical altercations that have come from a reincarnated person approaching a non-reincarnated person and basically saying, in a previous life, you or your family or your relatives insulted me in some capacity, my previous self, and we're going to fight about it right now. And those fights take place in this town, and it's totally normal. But the interactions between the reincarnated and non-reincarnated people in this township, it's not just about conflict. In fact, there's been lots of decisions made in this township that are designed very specifically to avoid conflict between the reincarnated and non-reincarnated. For example, there was a little boy who claimed to be the reincarnated spirit of a pig who was butchered in town, and the butcher, who this boy said butchered him when he was a pig, well, the butcher, to make sure he was not offending this boy or potentially other people who were, the reincarnated spirits of other animals he had slaughtered, the butcher shut down his business just to be like, I don't want to offend you all. I'll find something else to do with my life. And so when this mother heard the sound of her twin girls who had never spoke before, suddenly having this detailed conversation about people and events from this other village, as jarring and shocking as that was for her, because she lives in Pingyang, she instantly understood that the only way my girls could have that information and be able to have this conversation is if they are reincarnated spirits. And so this mother did what she thought was right, which was not to call a doctor, but instead to get the word out to the people not just in her village, but across the Pingyang Township that her twin daughters are actually reincarnated spirits. The mother's hope was that perhaps there were still family of these reincarnated spirits in this other village her daughters were referencing in their conversation that would find out about this, and maybe they'd want to come here and meet their family who now live inside of her daughters. And sure enough, less than a week after this mother got the word out, this man and woman who she didn't know came knocking at her door. When the mother let them inside the house, her girls immediately recognized them. One of the twins said that this was her mother and father from her previous life. Then the twins, these little 3-year-old girls, went on to tell this unbelievably complicated and sophisticated story about how in their previous life, these twin girls were not actually sisters. Instead, they were best friends, and together they had taken their own lives approximately 1 month before they were reborn in the bodies of these twin girls. And so after that, the twins just continued talking to this man and woman for quite some time, giving specific details about this village that, again, these girls, at least according to their mother, had never been to before. These girls also gave intimate details about these teenage girls' lives and even had information that was very specific to what happened to them when they took their lives and, where their bodies were found. Again, information these girls shouldn't have. And then at some point, the mother of the twins asked this man and woman, are these details they're giving you accurate? Is this true? And the man and woman said, yup, it's all true. And then at some point, the twins turned to their biological mother, and they told her that the reason they had been silent to this point was because they were trying to keep their reincarnation a secret. And also, the reason they slept all the time is because when they slept, they would dream about their previous lives, which they claimed to miss. To this day, no one's ever been able to offer a better explanation for how these twin girls, these toddlers, had such accurate information about people they had never met and places they'd never been to. Basically, the only explanation that works is that they must actually be the reincarnated spirits of those teenage girls. Pingyang Township remains a hotspot of alleged reincarnations, and nobody knows why. Our next story is called More Than a Feeling. At around 5 p.m. on August 29, 1954, a 53-year-old woman named Juliet Exline had just sat down on her couch with a book inside of her home in Los Angeles when she got this weird wave of anxiety that kind of rushed over her. Now, there was nothing she could think of that would cause her to feel this way, and she even looked around her house thinking, maybe there was something weird going on, but there was nothing. And so finally, Juliet, she put her book down and just took a few calming breaths to kind of go back to normal. She didn't know what was going on, but she could tell she was super anxious. Now, generally speaking, Juliet was a very mellow person. She was not prone to anxiety attacks like this, and so that kind of caught her off guard. And the only thing she could think of that was different than normal was her husband, Larry, was on a much-needed vacation, and so the last couple of days while he'd been gone had been maybe more lonely in the house, and so maybe that was causing her to feel this weird stress. She didn't know. But she told herself, Larry's vacation was definitely a good thing. Larry was an exterminator, and over the past 2 years, he had not taken a single day off. He was a total workaholic. And so when Larry began to talk about wanting to take a break, Juliet had encouraged him to put in time for some vacation time, put in a request. And Frank had actually done that, and as soon as his boss had approved a 2-week-long vacation, Larry had been so pumped he had called his friend, and they had immediately scheduled a fishing trip, and 4 days before, Frank and his friend had driven off to enjoy his time off. And so as Juliet thought about that, she told herself that, even if she was feeling a little bit anxious about Larry being gone, it really was a good thing for Larry, and it would improve not only his life, but her life as well. This was overall a good thing, and so she just needed to kind of deal with this anxiety that maybe or maybe not was connected to Larry. She didn't know. But for the rest of that evening, Juliet just could not get rid of this kind of baseline low-level nervousness she was feeling. And so at some point, she began getting up and walking around her house and confirming all the windows were shut and locked and the doors were locked. She was drawing curtains, checking in closets, making sure everything was totally safe. And then by 8 p.m., when she still just could not shake this anxiety, she decided she just needed to go to bed and kind of sleep this off. But after falling asleep, Juliet suddenly woke up at 10:15 p.m., drenched in sweat, with the most intense anxiety she had ever felt in her life. and she was totally disoriented. She's looking around her room like, what's going on here? And then she heard a voice. It was Larry's voice, except he sounded funny. He sounded like quiet, as if maybe he was outside the house trying to come in and he was calling to her. And so kind of in a panic, she jumped out of bed, ran into the hallway, and right in the hallway was Larry. He wasn't outside. He was right there. Except something was wrong with Larry. He was kind of hunched over and grabbing his stomach. He had his hand on the wall, and he also appeared to be soaking wet. And so Juliet had no idea what was going on, but between all that anxiety and now seeing Larry here in this weird state, she couldn't help herself. She just ran towards him to just make sure he was okay. But as soon as she got about a foot away from him, he held out his hand and said, "No, don't touch me. I have to go back." And what he said was so disorienting that Juliet just stopped and stared at her husband like, what is this? And that's when she made the startling realization that Larry was not soaking wet with water. He was soaking wet with blood. And he was clutching his stomach like something was bleeding in his midsection. And the reason he had sounded so quiet when he had called out to her and woken her up was because he was clearly hurt. And so Juliet has no clue what's going on. Like, her husband was supposed to be 7 hours away on this fishing trip. And so how is he here? It didn't make any sense. And so really not knowing what else to do, Juliet just said, I'm going to call the doctor. And so she ran past Larry, headed to the kitchen, and she was about to grab the phone on the wall. But before she could grab it, the phone began to ring. And so Juliet just answered it and said, hello, hello. And what she heard was the sound of a sheriff in Ely, Nevada. And he said, excuse me, is this Mrs. Exline, Juliet Exline? And she said, yes, what's going on? What's happened? And the sheriff said, ma'am, I'm sorry to tell you this, but I have some terrible news. Your husband got into a car accident, and unfortunately, he has passed away. And now the second the sheriff said this to Juliet, she just froze and goes, no, that's not possible. He's here with me right now. And Juliet turned around and looked into the hallway where Larry had been standing, and now Larry was gone. Larry really had died in that car accident because Juliet would bury her husband that week. But Juliet maintained that clearly after her husband had died, his spirit had somehow survived the accident, because when she saw her husband standing in the hallway, hunched over and covered in blood, it was at 10:15 p.m. She remembers because when she woke up, she saw the time. It was 10:15. And her husband had died at exactly 10:15 p.m., the exact moment she saw him in the hallway. Juliet would ultimately write an account of what she experienced with her husband. However, from that day forward, she never once saw her husband again. That was the only time. The next and final story of today's episode is called 1,000 Tortured Souls. Late one night in November of 1999, a 66-year-old minister named Colin Grant opened up the iron gates of a cemetery called Greyfriars Kirkland. This cemetery was one of the oldest and most famous cemeteries in Edinburgh, Scotland. Now, the cemetery was basically pitch black. However, there were a few old iron lanterns that lined the cobblestone path that cut through the cemetery. And so Colin pushed open these big gates, and he stepped onto this path, and he began walking, and on either side of him, for as far as he could see, were all these headstones, some of which dated back to the 1600s. And as he kept walking, he could see up ahead, even in the darkness, the huge Gothic-style church that sat right in the center of the cemetery. Now, at first glance, this cemetery just kind of looked like a pretty typical old cemetery, albeit a pretty spooky one. But to Colin, he knew there was far more than just a graveyard here. Deep underground in this cemetery, below where all the people had been buried at their headstones, was basically another cemetery. There was like this mass burial pit that the cemetery had been built on top of. And in this lower level cemetery, which in no way was marked, this is basically a hidden mass burial, were thousands of people who had been starved and tortured to death hundreds of years ago. And so Colin stopped for a second on the path and just kind of stared ahead at this church. And for a second, he thought about just turning and leaving, because he did not want to be here. He was really only here because the city of Edinburgh had begged him to come here. Colin, in addition to being a minister, claimed to be a psychic, which meant he could speak to the dead. And so the city of Edinburgh, in desperation, had asked him to come to this cemetery tonight and perform an exorcism. And so as much as Colin did just want to turn around and leave, he knew he really had a duty here, not just to the city, but really to the people of the city. Because if he didn't do this exorcism, there was a good chance more people were going to get hurt. The only thing that was making Colin a little bit less afraid in this moment was he actually was not alone in the cemetery. There were two people with him. There was a journalist and a photographer from a local newspaper who were basically tagging along to document this exorcism. And so after taking a minute to compose himself, Colin continued walking deeper into the cemetery with these two following behind him, and then before reaching the big church, Colin left the path and began cutting through the grass, passing by different headstones, on the way to perhaps the most infamous building in the entire cemetery, the Black Mausoleum. The Black Mausoleum was this tall stone crypt with a rounded top that had been built sometime in the late 1600s. And as Colin got closer to this pretty creepy-looking building that sat basically on the side of the cemetery, Colin began to feel this really intense sense of dread come over him. And the closer he got, that dread began to kind of manifest itself in like a pit in his stomach, and eventually he began feeling really scared of this building. And eventually Colin actually had to fully stop about 10 or so feet away from the building because he just felt like he couldn't go any closer. It felt evil. And then Colin turned and looked at his companions, the journalist and photographer, to see if maybe they were reacting to this mausoleum, but the two of them were just standing there with blank expressions on their face, like obviously not thinking that anything sinister was happening here. Even though the city had asked the minister to be here to perform this exorcism in this mausoleum, it didn't mean everybody believed what was going on here. And clearly these two didn't. They were totally skeptical. But this didn't offend Colin. He was used to people not believing in the things he believed in. And he knew as soon as he actually began his work, doing this exorcism, they would change their mind. And so at some point, Colin told the photographer that, hey, I'm going to go in the mausoleum now because I have to do the exorcism. Before I do, take a picture of the mausoleum. And so the photographer just raised her camera and took a picture of the mausoleum. Colin thanked her, and then he turned and began walking towards the building. When he got right in front of it, he looked up and he read the name across the top of the crypt. And it said George Mackenzie. And as Colin read that, he could feel his heart rate start to spike. So back in the late 1600s, George Mackenzie was a Scottish lord who worked for the King of England, enforcing the king's religious laws. But at the time, these laws were very unpopular. And there was one group called the Covenanters who hated these laws so much that they actually mounted a full-scale rebellion in 1679. But their rebellion failed miserably, and this is when George Mackenzie came in. He captured over 1,000 Covenanters, and he marched them all into this huge field, which would later become the Greyfriars Kirkland Cemetery, but at the time it was just a big open field, and he held them there, and for weeks he had these people starved and tortured and mutilated, and if anybody tried to run or resist because they knew they were doomed, they all knew they were going to die here, if anybody took off, he would capture them, cut their head off, and then place their head on a spike around the perimeter of this field. Until, after several weeks, the entire field is just ringed with decaying bodies and bloody heads on spikes. And so after a few months of this, basically everybody in that field had been murdered in some horrible way by George Mackenzie. And their bodies were all dumped into a mass grave in Greyfriars Kirkland and covered over, and then, hundreds of years later, a proper cemetery would be built right on top of that mass grave. And then, when George Mackenzie died later on, he lived a normal, happy, full life after doing all these horrible things, they built him this beautiful mausoleum in Greyfriars Kirkland, in the proper cemetery. And so here's this horrible person, George Mackenzie, who's a mass murderer, and he's put to rest in this beautiful mausoleum, just, feet away from this mass grave of all these people he killed. For almost 300 years after Mackenzie was buried, the Greyfriars Kirkland Cemetery was quiet. It was not considered a haunted place. That all changed, though, in 1998, so that was 1 year before Colin showed up to perform this exorcism. That year, in 1998, a homeless man broke into the Black Mausoleum, and he fell through the floor and landed in one of those mass burial pits of those people Mackenzie had killed. And apparently, basically right after this happened, visitors to the cemetery began reporting the same thing. That anytime they were in or near the Black Mausoleum, they'd get pushed or tugged on or scratched or burned or even strangled. I mean, people were coming out of the cemetery terrified. And so quickly, people in town began to speculate about, what was going on in the cemetery. And quickly, a story began to circulate around town that maybe when that guy fell through the floor in the mausoleum, that had released George Mackenzie's evil spirit. And his spirit was responsible for all these attacks. And so it went on like this for about a year until finally this young woman was found outside of the Black Mausoleum, unconscious, looking like she'd been strangled. And when she came to, she had no memory of what happened. And so people assumed this had to be another attack by the spirit of George Mackenzie. And so by this point, the city of Edinburgh was totally fed up with this. They didn't know what to do. And so they said, you know what? Let's just try an exorcism. Let's have someone go into that mausoleum and literally confront the spirit of George Mackenzie and banish him. Get him out of here and stop this madness. And so ultimately Colin was hired to perform this exorcism. However, as Colin stood there, reading the name George Mackenzie and mentally preparing himself to go inside of this horrible place, he realized he just couldn't do it. This was too much. And so Colin is just standing there feeling totally stressed out. He's embarrassed. He feels like a coward. He has no idea what he's going to say to the photographer and journalist who've literally come out here to document what he's going to do, and now he's not going to do it. But as Colin turned around to basically blurt out this really embarrassing news that, hey guys, we got to leave, he realized he actually knew something else he could do that in many ways might actually be better than going into this mausoleum and doing an exorcism. And so without saying anything, Colin just turned and began speed walking over to this big field that was not too far away from the Black Mausoleum. And when he got there, he just began chanting prayers and walking in circles, flicking holy water, didn't explain anything he was doing to the journalist and the photographer who'd followed him over there and are just watching him like, what's going on here? They got no idea. He's not clarifying. And for hours, this is what he did. He just kind of paced in this field, just kind of doing what looked like stereotypical, exorcism type behavior. And that's what the journalist and the photographer assumed he was doing. And so as Colin did whatever he was doing in this field, the photographer, whose name was Susan Burrell, just began doing her job, again, thinking that he was doing the exorcism. And so she just started taking pictures of him. And then finally, around 2 a.m., so again, this has been hours of Colin doing this thing he's doing, Colin just abruptly stops and walks over to Susan and the journalist, and Colin looks horrible. He's totally haggard, his hair's all disheveled, he's sweating, he's pale, and his head is down, and he says to the two women, I failed. He explained to them that his original intention was to go into the Black Mausoleum and confront George Mackenzie's spirit head on and banish him from the cemetery. However, he had had a change of heart at the door and decided to go this other route, which was to go to this big open field in the middle of the cemetery and attempt to free the spirits of all those Covenanters who had been tortured and killed by George Mackenzie. Colin's thinking was, if I can free all of these poor tortured souls, that maybe once they're gone, George Mackenzie's spirit will also go away. And while, according to Colin, he was able to free, 200 some odd trapped souls, he said there were many more that still needed to be freed, and he just didn't have the strength. Like, he couldn't do this right now. And so he said, I have to rest and do this at another time. Now, the journalist and the photographer were totally over this and did not care at all. It's 2 a.m. They don't really understand what he was doing. They don't really know if this was the exorcism or if it was something else. But to them, they're like, okay, fine. We'll get out of here. It's late. It's not a big deal. And so the three of them, they began walking out of the cemetery. And right when they got in front of the church, so basically between where the Black Mausoleum was and where that field was, where Colin had been for the past several hours, Colin abruptly stopped. And he told the journalist and the photographer that actually, you know what? He had a little strength left, and he felt like it was his duty to try this again. Because he knew he could free more souls, and so he was going to give it another go. And so the journalist and the photographer are like, okay. And so Colin, he gets out his Bible, and he begins kind of doing the same thing he was doing out in the field, walking around, chanting Bible verses, spraying holy water all around. And then at some point, for reasons he did not explain to either Susan or the journalist, he pulled out 12 candles from his backpack that he had brought along, and he put them in a circle on the ground right in front of this church. It also encompassed this big Celtic cross that was on the ground. And Colin was inside of this circle, and he lit all these candles, and the whole time again, he's chanting out these Bible verses, and he stands up, and right after all the candles have been lit, suddenly Susan and the journalist noticed the candles begin to flicker. And it's not windy at all inside the cemetery. Like, they shouldn't be flickering. And at the same time, Colin seemed to sense that something was happening around him, and he turned his whole body, his whole presence, and he looked over at the Black Mausoleum and began chanting these Bible verses louder and louder, like he was aiming them at the Black Mausoleum. And as he was doing this, the candles were flickering more and more and more, and at some point Colin actually picked up one of these candles and kind of held it out at the Black Mausoleum. And so at this point, the journalist and the photographer, Susan, they're sensing that something weird is happening here. Like, this is spooky what they're seeing. Like, why are the candles flickering? What's going on with Colin? Like, what's happening here? And for a minute, the two of them kind of abandoned their actual job, which is to document what they're seeing, and they just stood there kind of witnessing this totally bizarre event. But then Susan sort of broke out of it. She lifted up her camera, and right as Colin is passionately chanting out these verses, she takes a picture of him, and the second she does, the flash lights up the cemetery, and then after the flash goes away, Colin, it was like the light went out on him, and he just crumpled to the ground. And so the journalist immediately ran over to Colin to see if he was okay, and Colin, who's like barely conscious at this point, he just kept repeating, "This is going to kill me! This is going to kill me!" And so Susan was about to run over and join her colleague and make sure Colin was okay, but before she did, she glanced down at her camera to see the picture she had taken of Colin right before he collapsed. And as she glanced at it, she couldn't believe what she was looking at. At first she thought, maybe this is some trick of the light, like this can't be right. But then she zoomed in on the photo, and when she looked closely, she screamed. Colin the minister is standing there with the candle outstretched, and behind him is the big church, and on the church, on the left side, there are windows. Now, this church was locked up. Nobody was inside the church at the time, but you can clearly see in the left window, there is a figure in that window looking out at Colin. Now, of course, this is not evidence enough to make everybody believe that, oh, that must be George Mackenzie's spirit staring out at Colin. He's the reason Colin collapsed. But I'll tell you, this photograph is not the end of the story. Remember, after Colin collapsed to the ground after this photo was taken, the journalist ran over, and all Colin kept saying was, "This is gonna kill me, this is gonna kill me." Well, it would turn out he'd be right. Not long after this failed exorcism, Colin would die inexplicably. His death would come as a total shock to his friends and family. No one has ever been able to debunk the photo that Susan took that showed that dark figure in the window of the church, meaning nobody knows what that was. The church really was supposed to be empty and locked, and so how is there somebody or something in the window? Nobody knows. A lot of people think that could be the evil spirit of George Mackenzie, striking Colin down, and Susan managed to capture it on film, but it's up to you if you believe that or not. But I will say, to this day, people go into that cemetery and come out with scratch marks on them and, claiming they were pushed or pulled or strangled. And so that cemetery is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the world. And George Mackenzie's spirit, who supposedly haunts it, is considered to be one of the most dangerous poltergeists in the world as well. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballin podcast, as well as Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see you. In January of 1994, two teenagers were sitting in a bedroom in Texas studying for one of their classes. At some point, one of the teens picked up a copy of Shakespeare's play called Hamlet and began reading lines out loud. And at some point, the teen who was reading read aloud a particularly famous section of the play that deals with death. And at this point, the teen who was listening started rocking back and forth before finally just starting to sob. The teen who was reading stopped and asked what was going on, and in between sobs, the teen who was now very emotional said that the play had reminded them of a horrible thing that they knew about, but had not told anyone about. And now, after hearing those lines from Hamlet, the teen said they just had to get this secret off their chest, and so they would. Months later, the secret that was uttered inside that bedroom between these two teenagers would make front-page news across the country. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to install a sliding door lock on the Amazon Music Follow Button's bathroom door, but install it so that the latch doesn't quite reach the other side. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a December night in 1992, in a little apartment in a tiny Texas town called Mansfield, a 16-year-old girl named Marie Robards sat down at the dinner table. After taking her seat, Marie looked across the table and almost started laughing at her father, Stephen. Stephen, who was 38 years old and delivered mail for a living, was 6 foot 4 inches tall with long legs and long arms, and so him trying to sit at their little kitchen table made him look like a giant trying to sit at a kid's table. Stephen saw Marie smiling at him, and he smiled back, and then the two of them sniffed the air and exchanged excited looks. Stephen barely ever cooked, so he and Marie rarely sat down at the dinner table to eat together, but tonight was going to be different. Recently, Stephen had started dating a new woman who lived in the same apartment complex as he and Marie. Her name was Sandra Hudgens, and she loved to cook, and tonight, that was what she was doing. And her Mexican feast she was preparing was filling the apartment with delicious smells. As Sandra stood over the stove seasoning tacos, rice, and refried beans, Marie began telling her father about her day at school. She said all of her classes were interesting and going well, but chemistry was her favorite class. In fact, she said she loved science in general so much that she had started thinking about going into a pre-med program when she went to college in a couple of years so she could become a doctor. Stephen knew Marie could become a doctor if she wanted to, or really anything else she set her mind to. His daughter was intelligent, beautiful, charismatic, and a highly disciplined student. So much so that on the weekends, Marie often stayed in and just did schoolwork while most of her friends and peers were out and having fun and partying. And while this certainly made Stephen very proud of his daughter that she was so studious, secretly, Stephen sometimes wished that Marie would step away from her schoolwork even for a day and just go out and be a teenager and have some fun. And lately, given what Marie was going through with her mother and Stephen's ex-wife, this secret wish of his was all Stephen thought about when he looked at his daughter. Up until just a few months earlier, Marie had been living with her mother, Beth, and her stepfather, Frank, in a nearby town. Marie and her mom had always been incredibly close. Marie often said her mom was her best friend. But Marie's stepfather was a police officer who took discipline and rules very seriously, and so he was quite strict with Marie, which often caused the two of them to argue and created a lot of tension in their household. And their living situation got infinitely worse when Marie walked in on Frank in bed with another woman. Marie already did not like Frank, but now she hated him. However, when she went to her mom and told her what she had discovered about Frank, her mom, who was crushed by the news, no doubt, still said she would not be leaving Frank. This caused a huge fight between Marie and her mom, which ended with Marie moving out of the house and into her father's apartment. Stephen was overjoyed to have his daughter living with him, but at the same time, he knew this was not really a happy arrangement. Ultimately, he knew his daughter just really felt hurt by her mother and longed for things to go back to the way they were when she and her mom were just best friends. In the kitchen, Sandra announced that dinner was ready, and she turned away from the stove and began walking over to the dinner table, her hands full of serving dishes. And right as Marie got up to help Sandra put the food on the table, the landline telephone rang in the living room. They all looked at each other to see who was going to go pick it up, and Marie said she would, and that she would tell whoever was calling that they were in the middle of dinner and they should just call back. But a few moments later, when Stephen and Sandra heard Marie answer the phone in the other room, they heard Marie start yelling at whoever was calling. And after a few moments, even though they couldn't quite tell what Marie and this other person were actually yelling about, it became clear that the other person that she was talking to had to be her mother. Eventually, Marie slammed the phone down and stormed back into the kitchen, her face bright red and her hands shaking. Stephen asked her if she was okay and, what's wrong, but Marie just took a deep breath and suddenly a calm look came over her face and she just said, "I don't want to talk about it." And after a quick glance at each other, Stephen and Sandra simply nodded, and then before long, the trio was back to chatting about Marie's schoolwork and her college aspirations. But as much as Marie wished that big yelling fight she got into with her mother could just fade out of everyone's mind, it couldn't. Because over the next couple of months, Marie and her mother would get into more and more of these types of yelling fights on the phone. And Stephen and Sandra, who often overheard these fights, would always ask Marie afterward what was wrong and was everything okay. But Marie would just continue to ask for privacy and demand they not talk about it. And for the most part, Stephen and Sandra did just that. They rarely pried, and instead just kept an eye on Marie, hoping that someday soon, the fighting with her mother would just stop. And by the middle of February of 1993, so 2 months after that first yelling fight Marie got into with her mom, it seemed like that was exactly what had happened, because the angry phone calls stopped, and Marie seemed happier and somewhat back to normal. But beneath the surface, something else entirely was going on. On the night of February 18th, so right around the time that the yelling phone fights stopped between Marie and her mom, Marie was home alone at the apartment, sitting on the couch reading from one of her science textbooks. Her father, Stephen, was out at church, and Stephen's girlfriend, Sandra, was at her own apartment nearby. As Marie flipped through the pages, she heard something bang against the front door. She wasn't sure if someone had knocked, or if maybe someone had accidentally hit the outside of their door, and so Marie just sat there for a second staring at the door, wondering if the knocking sound would start again, and after a few seconds, she heard it again. Marie glanced at her watch and saw that her father had only left about 45 minutes earlier, and normally he would stay at church for hours at a time, so this likely was not him, and Sandra was not scheduled to come by that night, so it likely was not her either. Marie waited a moment, and when she heard yet another bang, she called out to see who was there, but no one answered. After a few more moments of silence, Marie stood up and began walking over to the door, but before she could get there, the front door suddenly flew open, and her father stumbled inside, and he looked absolutely terrible. His face was pale, and even though it was cold outside, there was sweat dripping down his forehead, and his dress shirt was also drenched in sweat. Marie frantically began asking her dad what was wrong, what was going on, but all Stephen could get out was that he needed to lay down. So Marie rushed over and helped her enormous father stumble across the room until he kind of collapsed on the couch. And then once he was lying down, Marie, who was really starting to panic, told her father she was going to get Sandra and she'd be right back. And so a moment later, Marie had run out the front door into the cold night air, and she charged across the parking lot over to the row of apartments where Sandra lived, and then once she found Sandra's door, she began pounding on it. When Sandra flung the door open, wondering what was going on, Marie quickly explained that her father was very sick and they needed to do something, and so without asking any more questions, Sandra just ran with Marie back to the apartment. When they got there, they found Stephen still lying on the couch, but he was borderline unresponsive and looking much more pale than when Marie had left him. Sandra had no idea what was going on, but she knew whatever this was, it was bad, and so she rushed into the living room, she picked up the phone, and she dialed 911. The paramedics would arrive just a few minutes later, but it was already too late. Stephen had died. Shortly after his death, the coroner would conduct an autopsy and conclude that Stephen had died from a heart attack. After her father's death, Marie, who was totally crushed, moved back in with her mother, Beth, and her stepfather, Frank. Even though Marie and her mother had stopped fighting, their relationship was by no means fixed, and Marie still hated Frank. But Beth promised Marie that things would be different this time around, And true to her word, Beth made a real effort to spend as much time as she could with Marie, just like the old days. And for a time, despite the tragic loss of her father, Marie was basically happy. But in the summer of 1993, a few months after Stephen died, Marie discovered a note that another woman had written to Frank, and based on that note, it was obvious to Marie that Frank was still cheating on her mother. But again, when Marie brought this note to her mother and pleaded with her to leave Frank and for them to just go live by themselves somewhere else, Marie's mother refused and said she would not be leaving Frank no matter what. And when she said that, Marie felt like her mother had turned her back on her and was choosing Frank over her own daughter. As such, Marie decided that she could not bear to live with either of them anymore. So in June, just 4 months after Marie had moved back in with her mom, Marie moved out again, this time to live with her grandfather, who lived in Mansfield, the same town where Stephen's apartment had been. Right away, Marie felt totally relieved to be away from all the drama surrounding her mother and Frank. And not long after moving in with her grandfather, Marie's senior year of high school began, and quickly, Marie was fully immersed in her schoolwork and spending almost no time worrying about all the issues in her family. Marie also began going out and seeing friends on the weekends, just like her father had always secretly hoped she would. But as happy and normal as Marie seemed, beneath the surface, this was not true. Because Marie had a secret that she was now starting to struggle to contain. One afternoon in January of 1994, almost a year after Stephen's death and 6 months after Marie had moved in with her grandfather, Marie and one of her friends went back to Marie's grandfather's house to study after school. The two girls walked into Marie's bedroom, took off their winter coats, tossed their backpacks on the floor, and then after talking for a few minutes about school and what they wanted to do that weekend, they both decided it was time to actually start studying. And so Marie and her friend both sat down on the floor, they unzipped their backpacks and took out their copies of Hamlet that they were reading for their English class. Hamlet is a very famous play by William Shakespeare that tells the story of a Danish prince whose father, the king, has died. Marie and her friend discussed the plot and the characters of Hamlet, and then Marie's friend said she wanted to read out loud one of her favorite parts of the play. So she flipped through her book and found the section she was looking for, and then Marie's friend held her book up in front of her face, cleared her throat, and started reading that section out loud. Marie's friend read a part of a very intense scene where one of the characters reveals a secret he's kept throughout the play. "Oh, wretched state! Oh, bosom black as death!" the character cries out to make it clear how upset he is about this secret. Marie listened to her friend read this part, and all of a sudden, she began feeling this pit in her stomach forming. Marie's hands started to tremble, she felt a lump growing in her throat, and then she just started sobbing. Her friend who was reading was stunned, and she stopped reading mid-sentence and asked Marie what was wrong. Marie struggled to catch her breath. Then she wiped the tears from her eyes, and she looked up, and through a cracking voice, she told her friend that, like the character in the play, she too had a secret that she had never told anyone, but now she had to get it off her chest. Marie's friend was stunned at this revelation, but quickly told Marie that she could trust her, and that whatever the secret was, she was sure Marie would be okay, that they could figure out what to do together. But when Marie actually began telling the friend what this secret was, the friend's face went pale and her mouth opened in horror. Marie's secret, which had to do with her deceased father, was way bigger than the friend had anticipated. And if this was true, and the friend told anyone about it, it would make headlines around the country. Based on this wild secret story that Marie would tell her friend, and on later interviews conducted with Marie and Stephen's friends and family, here is a reconstruction of what happened the night Stephen Robards died in his apartment on February 18th, 1993. On February 18th, about an hour before Stephen left for church, a delivery person arrived at Stephen and Marie's apartment with the takeout Mexican food Stephen had ordered for dinner. After paying the delivery person, Stephen put the containers of food on the kitchen counter so Marie could begin eating, while Stephen stepped into the other room to get dressed for church. When he came back out again, he wolfed down a plate of food, gave Marie a kiss and said goodbye, and then headed out the door for the night.
Once outside, Stephen got into his car and made the short drive to the church he attended in his neighborhood. He was in a great mood because he always looked forward to weeknight services. There was usually a smaller crowd than on Sundays, so it was easier for him to talk to friends and share in the community experience the church had to offer. When Stephen finally arrived at the church, he stepped out of his car and began walking towards the entrance. Even though it was a cold winter night for North Texas, with temperatures lower than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, Stephen felt warm and sweat was starting to bead on his forehead. But he just wiped the sweat away and didn't think too much about it. Stephen walked inside the church, took off his coat, and began chatting with other members of the congregation who were standing near the front door greeting new arrivals. A few moments later, Stephen had left the front entryway and made his way to a seat in one of the church's long wooden pews. Shortly after that, as the minister took his place in front of the congregation and got ready to begin the service, Stephen's vision began to blur. He felt sweat dripping down his forehead again, and now he was having a hard time focusing, like he was overtired or something. But Stephen just continued to wipe the sweat away and told himself everything was fine. But just a few moments later, he began to feel a sharp pain in his stomach. Stephen winced and grabbed at his midsection and bent over in the pew. The people sitting next to him looked worried and asked if Stephen needed any help. He told them he was okay through gritted teeth, but as he did, he started to feel nauseous, and so quickly he stood up, apologized to the people sitting next to him, and he hustled out of the row and out of the church as fast as he could. Once outside, Stephen felt the cold air hit his skin, but he was still burning up and sweating profusely. The pain in his stomach was getting worse too, but he managed to not throw up and got into his car, turned it on, and began driving out of the lot back towards home. By the time Stephen pulled into a parking spot in front of his apartment, the pain in his stomach had gotten exponentially worse, and now, on top of everything else, he was struggling to breathe. He managed to get his car door open, and he groaned in pain as he stumbled to the front door of his apartment. His hands were shaking as he raised his keys up to the lock and tried to unlock the door, but he couldn't get the keys to fit in, and he sort of fell forward and slammed against the outside of the door. This was the first loud thumping sound that his daughter would hear inside as she studied her science textbook. Stephen took a breath and then managed to get the keys into the lock and open the door, stumbling inside practically onto Marie. Marie helped him lay down on the couch, and then she ran off to get Sandra. Meanwhile, Stephen's throat began tightening up like he was being choked. And while Stephen lay alone on the couch waiting for Marie and Sandra to return, he began to convulse and foam at the mouth. And when Sandra and Marie did return to the apartment, Stephen was no longer responsive, and a few minutes later, when paramedics arrived, it was obvious to everyone in the room that Stephen was just getting worse. And so Sandra, sensing this, grabbed Marie and pressed her face into her chest so Marie would not have to see her father die. Stephen then made one final gasping sound, and then he would die. As Sandra began to cry, Marie pulled herself away from her and just stood there motionless, staring over at her now deceased father. Even though Marie's outward expression showed shock and horror and sadness, inside, Marie felt differently. She was pleased. The night had gone exactly to plan. After Stephen had put that takeout food on the kitchen counter and then stepped into the other room, Marie had rushed over to the kitchen, pulled out a folded-up paper towel from her pocket that contained an odorless, tasteless white powder inside of it, and then Marie quickly sprinkled that powder into the refried beans, something she knew her father would be eating. She stirred it up so he wouldn't notice, and then she grabbed a few untainted tacos for herself, rushed back to the couch, and waited in the other room. When her dad came out a few minutes later, she watched with joy as her dad did exactly what she hoped. He began eating huge quantities of the refried beans. Afterward, he grabbed his jacket, gave Marie a kiss, and headed out the door for church, not realizing he was already a dead man. Marie had poisoned her father, but it would turn out the reason she did it really had nothing to do with Stephen. Instead, it had to do with her mother and her very strict stepfather, Frank. Frank believed it was very important that Marie, whose parents were obviously divorced, pick which biological parent, Beth or Stephen, she wanted to live with. And once that decision was made, he told her it was final. Frank did not want Marie to feel like she could bounce back and forth from one household to the other. She basically needed to commit to one family or the other, and that was it. And Frank told Marie, who was living with Frank and Beth, and so her de facto decision had been to live with them, that if Marie ever moved out to go live with Stephen, then Marie would never be welcome back to live with Beth and Frank. And after Marie caught Frank cheating on her mother, and her mother refused to leave Frank, Marie moved out of the house and in with Stephen. But shortly after moving in with Stephen, Marie had a change of heart and missed her mother terribly and wanted to move back in with her and with Frank. But because of Frank's rule, Frank said no. Marie had been furious and tried to persuade her mother to change Frank's mind and let her come back home and live with them, but her mother continued to stand by Frank and just said, no, you need to stay with your father now. And so this led to all of those yelling fights Marie got into with her mother on the phone that Stephen and Sandra kept overhearing. Marie was absolutely furious and heartbroken and eventually felt so desperate to find a way to go live with her mom again that she decided the only way was to kill her father, because then her mother and Frank would have to take her back. And so, on February 18th, 1993, Marie poisoned her father's refried beans with a chemical called barium acetate, which is toxic to humans. Marie had stolen the chemical from her chemistry classroom. The reason the coroner had not noticed that Stephen had been poisoned is because in order to detect barium acetate, you basically need to run a special test at a special facility. And the coroner had not thought there was any evidence of foul play, so he had not asked for that test to be run. Marie had gotten away with murder. But nearly a year later, while studying Hamlet, Marie's friend happened to read the part of the play out loud where Hamlet's uncle admits to killing Hamlet's father. And in that moment in the play, Hamlet's uncle realizes he'll never be forgiven because no matter what he does, he will always be a murderer. And when Marie heard those words, "O wretched state, O bosom black as death," she felt a crushing sense of guilt wash over her, and she promptly confessed to her friend what she had done to her father. Marie's friend kept Marie's secret for several months, and during that time, Marie did get to move back in with her mother, until of course she moved out again after catching Frank cheating again, and she moved in with her grandfather, and then shortly after that, Marie's friend did go to police, at which point Marie was arrested. Marie was ultimately found guilty of murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. However, in 2003, she was granted parole and is believed to still be living in Texas today under a different last name. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballin, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not available on this podcast. They're only on the YouTube channel. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Late one night in the spring of 1937, a young woman stumbled into her New York City apartment building, drunk from a long night of partying with friends. She made her way up the steps and reached her apartment door, and after she opened it up, she stepped inside and her little dog ran up to say hello, and so she gave her dog a pet, and then she walked towards her bedroom. But the moment she stepped foot into that pitch-black bedroom, something just felt off. It was too quiet. But before she could figure out why that was, something heavy came flying out of the darkness and hit her on the face. And for a moment, the woman just stood there, stunned. And then a second later, something else emerged from the darkness. 2 hands. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week. Once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you're at the Amazon Music Follow Button's house for a party, ask if you can add a song to play next, but then proceed to only add our brand new show, Run Fool. Okay, let's get into today's story.
On the evening of March 27, 1937, a 20-year-old woman named Veronica Ronnie Gideon walked alone down a dark street in New York City. She hugged herself against the early spring chill as she made her way to the home of a man she barely knew. Ronnie's boyfriend had left for the Easter weekend to visit his family, so he had asked his best friend to keep an eye on Ronnie while he was away. That friend had invited Ronnie to his place for dinner and then an evening of drinking and dancing. And that's where Ronnie was headed right now. She was feeling a bit nervous, but also excited, and she was wearing one of her favorite outfits, a pretty blue tea dress. Ronnie thought it was pretty funny that her boyfriend was so worried she might cheat on him that he had basically set her up on a date tonight himself. Sure, a second man was going to join Ronnie and her boyfriend's best friend, but that just meant Ronnie would be out on the town with two men that were not her boyfriend. And they planned to stay out at the bars until they closed at 3 a.m. But even if she didn't admit this, Ronnie did understand why she made her boyfriend nervous. She was totally gorgeous, with a bubbly personality and a quick sense of humor. She also had a modeling career that was really starting to get her noticed, too. In fact, recently, she'd started to think she could actually become a famous model. Only a few days earlier, the latest issue of Inside Detective magazine had hit newsstands all over the city, and there on the cover was Ronnie herself. In the photo, she looked terrified, with one arm shielding her face and the other covering her bare chest. The picture was supposed to illustrate an alarming story called Party Girl, about unmarried young women who like to drink and have premarital sex until they all get sent to jail for immorality. In the 1930s, true crime magazines that featured barely dressed young women in danger were enormously popular, and Ronnie had appeared on several covers with headlines like "Pretty but Cheap" and "I Am a White Slave." But the real Ronnie was nothing like those pictures. She liked to go out and have a good time, but she wasn't wild. She had only been in love one time, when she was 16 years old and she eloped with a family friend named Bobby Flower, but that marriage ended disastrously after only a few weeks. And for many nights after that breakup, Ronnie felt heartbroken about losing Bobby, and she'd write about him in her diary until she fell asleep. And now, 4 years later, despite having a new boyfriend, Ronnie wasn't actually looking for love. She was just looking to have fun. And what better place than New York City, Ronnie thought as she stepped off the curb to cross Fifth Avenue. And at that moment, a yellow taxicab zipped by close enough to make Ronnie jump back and jolt her out of her daydream. And then, after collecting herself, she looked up and she could see she was just a few blocks away from Steve's place near Central Park. Steve's neighborhood was way more fashionable than Ronnie's. Ronnie still lived at home with her mother, Mary Gideon, in a tiny fourth-floor apartment near the East River. Ronnie found her home to be pretty depressing. Her mother had been unhappily married to her father, Joseph Gideon, for decades, until her father had left the family 3 years earlier. Joseph was a sour man who repaired furniture for a living, and he did not approve of Ronnie's love of the nightlife. Ronnie had been relieved when he moved out, though he still had a key and came over on holidays and on some weekends. But even without Ronnie's dad around, the apartment was still overcrowded. This was the Great Depression, and people often rented extra rooms to strangers to raise extra money. One of Mary and Ronnie's roommates was a boarder named Frank Burns, who lived in one of the bedrooms and joined the family at dinner each night, and the other boarder was one of Ronnie's friends, who was just staying temporarily. So lately, Ronnie had been sharing the same bed as her mother. Ronnie loved her mother, but she sometimes felt like the walls were closing in when they would spend the evening together listening to the radio in their tiny living room. It was even harder when Frank joined them. He was partially deaf, and her mother had to turn the radio up super loud just so he could hear his favorite show, Amos and Andy. And Frank was just one in a parade of boarders who intruded on Ronnie's family life. Ronnie recalled one other boarder, a struggling artist named Bob Irwin, who wanted to marry her big sister, Ethel. Her sister was a very beautiful woman, but who hid her beauty behind horn-rimmed glasses and hair that was pulled into a tight bun. She said she was not interested in Bob, but Bob never gave up. He continued to drop in on the family even after he had moved out. In short, the apartment had long felt like a prison to Ronnie. By comparison, she felt absolutely free when she went out to the bars and clubs of New York. Just then, Ronnie passed by the famous Radio City Music Hall, where she had seen the movie Snow White with her boyfriend, Lincoln Hauser, a couple of months earlier. And they had had so much fun, Ronnie remembered, and the colors were totally amazing. Lincoln liked to tell people that the two of them were engaged, which was not actually true, but they were a pretty good couple. And thinking about this made Ronnie feel kind of strange that she was now about to go have dinner and drinks with Lincoln's best friend. Ronnie approached the front door of her boyfriend's friend, Stephen Butter, a little before 8 p.m. As she climbed the front steps, she could hear big band swing music blaring from Stephen's radio. She rang the bell. Moments later, Stephen, who was dressed in a sharp pinstripe suit complete with a pocket handkerchief, opened the door and welcomed Ronnie inside with a theatrical bow. This was going to be a fun night. For the next 6 hours, Ronnie lost herself in the evening with Stephen and his other friend. They had planned to go bar hopping, but they were having such a good time dancing to the radio music while drinking gin and beer that they just stayed at Stephen's place until quite late. Stephen expected Ronnie to make them dinner, but she wasn't offended. The kitchen was considered women's work in those days, so Ronnie made a pasta dinner for all three of them. Stephen was not quite as handsome as Ronnie's boyfriend, and his family was not quite as wealthy. But Ronnie thought he was still very charming and had lots of promise. He was working on Wall Street after all, and the more gin and beer they drank, the more they flirted and danced cheek to cheek. Finally, at 2 a.m., Stephen's other friend called it a night and went home, but Steve and Ronnie decided their night was not quite done. They threw on their coats and they headed for the Monte Carlo Bar and Grill, which was on the way to Ronnie's apartment, for a few more gin highballs. As Ronnie swallowed her last sip of alcohol, she thought about how her night might have turned out if she'd listened to her mother. Mary had wanted Ronnie home to help in the kitchen. Tomorrow was Easter Sunday, and they were expecting guests, Ronnie's sister Ethel and her husband, as well as their father. But Ronnie had secretly slipped out the door for the evening while her mother was still out shopping for the pork loin and green beans. Ronnie felt guilty, but not too much. By the time Steve escorted Ronnie back to her apartment building, they were leaning on each other to keep from falling down. But they both knew that since Ronnie was dating Steve's best friend, they shouldn't let things get romantic. So instead of a goodnight kiss, Steve offered to escort Ronnie to church the next morning for Easter Mass at 10, and she happily said yes. Ronnie let herself in the main building door and began climbing the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment. She was a little dizzy from all the booze, but she felt lighthearted. Steve had been a good companion for the evening, and she was glad that she'd see him again in the morning. Ronnie walked in the door of her apartment at about 3 a.m., trying to be extra quiet so she didn't wake up the people inside, which included her mother and one of the 2 boarders named Frank. As for the other boarder, which was Ronnie's friend, they were out of town. Ronnie quietly ducked into the bathroom near the front door and undressed down to her slip. She took off her makeup and washed her face and hands. She brushed her teeth and then brushed her hair. And then finally, she was ready for bed, and so she tiptoed to the dark, silent bedroom where she and her mother slept. As she entered the bedroom, Ronnie couldn't see or hear a thing, not even her mother's breathing. And then suddenly, a hard object struck Ronnie in the face. It stunned Ronnie far more than it hurt her, but she was so terrified and confused, she didn't move an inch. And then a second later, a man's hand came out of the blackness and squeezed around Ronnie's throat and then shoved her roughly onto the bed. "Please don't touch me," Ronnie managed to croak in little more than a whisper, but the man just squeezed tighter. The next morning was Easter, and Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon, woke up feeling totally hungover inside of the little room he had been renting since he separated from Ronnie's mother, Mary. But despite Joseph's throbbing headache from all the beers and shots of alcohol he had drank the night before, Joseph was actually in a great mood. He was going to have dinner with his family, and he and his estranged wife, Mary, had big news. After 3 years of separation, they were actually going to give married life another try. Joseph could not wait to tell his 2 daughters. Joseph slapped on his fedora hat and whistled as he walked the few blocks from his rented room to his wife's apartment, arriving a full half an hour before his 2:30 p.m. invitation. Not wanting to be rude by showing up early, Joseph found a payphone and called Mary, but no one answered. But Joseph didn't mind. He figured they must still be out at the Easter parade, and so in the meantime, he went shopping for gifts for his family, which included buying cigars that he planned to smoke with his daughter Ethel's husband to celebrate his reunion with his ex-wife Mary. But when Joseph returned back to Mary's apartment building and rang the front entrance door to the lobby at about 2:40 p.m., there was still no answer inside, and Joseph suddenly wondered if he had gotten the time wrong. Joseph was still standing right outside the main door of this building when his daughter Ethel and her husband came up behind him. Ethel told Joseph that he was right, the dinner was scheduled for 2:30 p.m., but she thought, maybe Mom might have the radio up too loud, and so she can't hear the buzzing of the bell when you ring it. And so Joseph nodded and tried the bell a couple more times, but still nobody opened up the front door. Eventually, another tenant inside the building heard all this buzzing and just let all three of them in the main door to the building. Joseph immediately bounded up the 4 flights of stairs to Mary and Ronnie's apartment. He was going to give them a piece of his mind for leaving the Easter guests waiting outside. But when he got to the actual apartment door, leaving Ethel and her husband far behind, Joseph immediately knew something just wasn't right. The front door was not fully shut, it had not latched, and so when Joseph pushed on it just lightly, it flung open. And when he stepped into the living room, he saw Ronnie's little Pekingese dog named Tucci. Usually, Tucci would run right up to him, but today, Tucci stayed put and just sat there very reserved, with her ears flat against her head. Joseph called out for Mary and Ronnie, but there was only silence in the apartment. Joseph looked across to the kitchen and saw the pork, which was supposed to be today's dinner, sitting on the counter, obviously uncooked. Joseph went into the bedroom that Mary and Ronnie shared, but no one was there. Nothing was disturbed, except there were broken pieces of a bar of soap scattered all across the carpet. With mounting anxiety, Joseph then entered the second bedroom where Ronnie used to sleep until her friend moved in, and what he saw in there was worse than anything Joseph could have imagined. His daughter, Ronnie, was lying stark naked on the bed, her eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. Her skin was the color gray-blue, and her neck was mottled with dark bruises. Joseph practically fell over in his haste to get out of the room containing his daughter's corpse. But when he stumbled into the third bedroom, there was only more horror. Frank, the boarder, was lying under the covers, the blanket right up to his neck, but his head was mutilated and covered in blood. Joseph could not take it anymore, and he just ran out of the apartment and began charging down the stairs while screaming, "They're all dead!" He breathlessly told Ethel and her husband about the terrible things he had just seen, and they both instantly went pale. But then Ethel asked, "Well, what about Mother?" Joseph said he had not seen her, and he just hoped she had escaped and ran to the police. And then Joseph did exactly that. He ran out of the apartment and then ran a block away to the neighborhood police station, where he reported what he had just found. Minutes later, Joseph returned to the apartment, now with a detective by his side. And almost immediately, the detective made another shocking discovery. He saw a foot sticking out from under the bed that Ronnie was lying on top of. Peering underneath, the detective could see there was another body. It was Mary Gideon, and she was fully dressed and had terrible bruising around her neck. Whoever had killed her had apparently tried to hide her body by wedging it beneath the bed. All 3 victims' bodies were very stiff by the time they were found. They had clearly all been dead for hours. By late Sunday afternoon, a small army of New York detectives, led by tough guy Assistant Chief Inspector John A. Lyons, had descended on Ronnie and Mary's apartment, and the flashbulbs of crime scene photographers popped in every room as they recorded details of the gruesome murders. The detectives found a single gray suede glove in Frank's bedroom, likely left behind by the killer. They also found Ronnie's torn silk panties behind the headboard where her body lay, suggesting it was her assailant who had removed her clothes, either before or after killing her. Aside from the corpses, though, the apartment seemed totally undisturbed. This was not a robbery. The killer came specifically for these people. Inspector Lyons concluded that the boarder, Frank, one of the victims, was probably killed first as he slept. Someone had stabbed him 11 times in the head, likely with an ice pick. His skull was nearly caved in. Both Ronnie and Mary had been strangled to death by someone's hands, and Mary, at least, had put up a fierce fight. She had bruises all over her knuckles. The detectives could not say for sure if the women had been sexually assaulted, but it seemed fairly obvious to Inspector Lyons that they must have. However, he would leave it to the medical examiner to confirm that detail. One other thing stood out to Inspector Lyons as he puffed on a cigar and watched another detective give Ronnie's dog a belly scratch. Why didn't the neighbors hear anything whilst 3 brutal murders were committed in the middle of the night? Tucci was the type of nervous little dog that barked incessantly at strangers, but apparently Tucci had not made a sound at all, or had just been so quiet that neighbors were not woken up by the dog. But to Lyons, the implication here was clear. Whoever committed what would soon be known as the Easter Sunday Massacre must have known this dog well, so much so that the dog did not bark when they saw this person. The next day, the murders made the papers. In New York, there were newspapers that warned of a, quote, sex fiend that was on the loose in the city and that he would surely strike again. The media really fixated on the fact that Ronnie was this beautiful model who was found in the nude, and so they eagerly printed these photographs from Ronnie's modeling work where she was in various states of undress. By coincidence, Ronnie had been murdered exactly 1 year after another sensational murder just down the street. A delivery man had snuck into the apartment of writer Nancy Titterton and then assaulted her, strangled her, and left her tied up naked in her bathtub. Now, the Titterton murder seemed to be happening all over again, the newspaper said. One newspaper said that all American women were now in danger from the rising wave of sex murders. Locksmiths reported a sudden increase in lock sales to men eager to protect their women from predators. Inspector Lyons felt his blood pressure starting to rise as he read the morning headlines while he finished his breakfast. A story about the murder described Ronnie as being this prize beauty who was slaughtered by a sex-crazed lunatic who was still on the loose. To Lyons, stories like these just made his job harder, whipping up public fears and putting pressure on the police to find the killer faster, which he felt just encouraged sloppy detective work. Just then, as if on cue, the police commissioner himself called Lyons, and he told him to take as many detectives as he needed because solving the Easter Sunday Massacre was now the department's top goal. By the time Lyons set off for police headquarters that morning, he had a plan to employ 75 detectives who would talk to everyone who lived near the Gideons, and they would talk to anyone who knew the Gideons over the past few years. This would be one of the biggest criminal investigations in New York City's history. And Lyons would make it clear to his massive team of investigators that they should not hesitate to get rough with people if they had to. One of the first people brought in for questioning was Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon. At 4 p.m. that Monday, Joseph Gideon reported to the same neighborhood police station where he came running to plead for help the day before. This time, though, he was trailed by a gang of reporters who were shouting questions at him while he remained grimly silent. Joseph expected to be treated as a grieving loved one, but the police treated him like a suspect from the start. They fingerprinted him and made him empty all his pockets to be sure he had no weapons. Then they relentlessly grilled him with questions for 12 hours as detectives took turns trying to get Joseph to break down. But over the course of this interview, Joseph only grew more ornery. Joseph had an alibi. Well, sort of. He had spent Saturday evening drinking at a bar and playing skee-ball with some other people who could confirm he was there. But by the time his daughter and his ex-wife were killed sometime after 3 a.m., Joseph was sleeping off the bender in his bed with no witnesses. One detective called Joseph a liar for saying he had nothing to do with the heinous crime, so Joseph called the detective a liar right back. Police eventually had to let Joseph go at about 4 a.m. on Tuesday because they had absolutely no evidence that he had done anything wrong, but they weren't quite done with Joseph. When Joseph went to his furniture repair shop to open up for the day a few hours later, he found 5 detectives waiting for him. They immediately seized the long needles that Joseph used for working on upholstery to see if maybe they matched the wounds on Frank Burns' head. Now, Joseph complained very bitterly to police. He couldn't even do his job. Reporters who had been tailing Joseph saw him blow up at the police, and they immediately crowded around the little upholsterer. And this time, Joseph shocked them by saying really horrible things about his dead wife and daughter. He said that his daughter, Ronnie, was wild and willful and that she loved to tease men. Maybe one of them had finally killed her for it, he said. When one of the reporters suggested that the killer could be someone romantically involved with his wife, he scoffed. He said that his wife was so cold that men, aside from him, probably would not find her attractive. As Joseph was talking to these reporters, he showed no sign that he was actually grieving the loss of his family. Instead, he just seemed really, really mad. And so after a wave of newspaper stories printed Joseph's harsh comments, Lyons' investigators began focusing even harder on Joseph. He certainly seemed unfeeling enough to potentially have killed his own family. Now, the detectives were obviously very suspicious of Joseph Gideon, but that didn't mean anything he said to them they didn't take seriously. And so when Joseph suggested police should really look into all the men in his daughter's life to see if maybe they had something to do with it, the police said, yeah, we will do that. And so the police tracked down all the men who had dated Ronnie over the years, or Ronnie had been close to in some way, starting with Stephen Butter, the man that Ronnie had been with the evening right before she had died, the best friend of her boyfriend. Stephen had gone to pick up Ronnie for Easter Mass as they had planned to on Sunday morning, but when he got there just before 10 a.m., no one answered the buzzer. And so Stephen went back home, perplexed, and he kept calling Ronnie periodically throughout the day until 3 p.m. when a detective answered the phone. The detective told Stephen they needed to talk to him right away, but didn't say why. By the time Stephen got to the police station an hour later, he was so nervous he was visibly shaking. But when police began speaking to him, he didn't really add much of value. Stephen didn't even know Ronnie was dead until he got to the police station. All Stephen could say was that Ronnie was a, quote, swell kid, and they had a, quote, swell time together. Lyons pretty much immediately dismissed Stephen as a suspect, but Ronnie's social life left investigators with plenty more men to talk to, and Ronnie had some seriously complicated relationships with men. When Ronnie's boyfriend, Lincoln Hauser, spoke to detectives at his home, he alternated between praise for Ronnie as a sweet church-going young woman and slammed her as a party girl who often stayed out all night and loved to, quote, play the field with other men. Lincoln admitted that he worried his girlfriend would cheat on him when he was away, but he trusted his friend Stephen to keep an eye on her for him, which is why he had set them up to hang out that night. But Lincoln would say, despite the quarrels they had in their relationship, he loved Ronnie and was absolutely devastated by her death. Also, Lincoln had a solid alibi. He was 50 miles away with family when Ronnie was killed. Ronnie's ex-husband, Bobby, came to the police station next for questioning, and he insisted he had no hard feelings after his marriage to Ronnie broke up. He said they were both too young to be married, and they stayed friends and even got together once in a while. He had last seen Ronnie a few weeks before her death when they went to a movie. At some point, Bobby would tell Detective Lyons that he really hoped they would find the murderer and send him to the electric chair. So far, Ronnie's love life had not produced much in the way of a suspect. Of all her partners, Bobby was probably Lyons' best bet given the failed marriage, but both Bobby and Ronnie seemed to have genuinely moved on from each other. Then, one of Ronnie's closest friends suggested that police take a look at a sometime chauffeur named George Frenchy Guéret, who previously rented a room in Mary and Ronnie's apartment. He was an eccentric man who wore his chauffeur's uniform even when he wasn't working, and he spoke in a heavy French accent. But behind his kind of goofy, harmless exterior, Frenchy had a criminal record. Most importantly, according to Ronnie's friend, he had fought with Ronnie's mother, Mary, over money. In addition, Frenchy had developed a crush on Ronnie, but she had no interest, and she told him to leave her alone. Two of Lyons' detectives visited Frenchy at his rented room a few blocks from Ronnie's apartment. There, they would find 2 bloody handkerchiefs, which Frenchy blamed on nosebleeds. Frenchy did have an alibi, saying he had spent Easter weekend at a buddy's apartment, but when the detectives visited that apartment, they found no less than 4 ice picks, including one that appeared to be blood-stained. By Monday afternoon, the late editions of the newspapers were speculating that Frenchy had committed these murders, perhaps with the help of the friend he stayed with that weekend. Police quickly arrested both men. But a police analyst determined that the stain on the ice pick seized by police was not blood, it was rust. And they had no other evidence to connect Frenchie and his friend to the murders, and so Lyons reluctantly let them go. At a crowded press conference on Tuesday, 3 days after the murders, Lyons showed serious frustration from the 3 days of nonstop investigating with little to show for it. He admitted that detectives were, quote, in the dark about who killed Mary, Ronnie, and Frank. There was one very small bit of good news, though. The coroner reported that there was no physical evidence that either woman was sexually assaulted. Maybe the killer was not a sex fiend after all. And so the detectives decided to redouble their efforts on looking into Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon. Everywhere Joseph went in those first days after the murders, he was followed by reporters, giving him endless chances to say something to make his position worse. He knew that he was under police scrutiny, but he boasted to reporters that the police could not break him. And he flew into a rage when reporters questioned his whereabouts at the time of the killings. Adding to public suspicions, the walls of Joseph's shop were covered with French postcards featuring naked women, and he admitted to a fondness for erotica. One newspaper said that Joseph suffered from, quote, queer animal desires that prompted him to leave his wife. Maybe, the newspaper speculated, Joseph was driven by some perversion to kill his own family. On Thursday, April 1st, so 4 days after the murders, detectives returned to Joseph's shop to look for a long needle that they had missed on their first sweep. They had already confiscated most of Joseph's tools, but a sharp-eyed upholsterer who did not know Joseph, who just happened to see a picture in the newspaper of all of Joseph's equipment that had been confiscated, told police that it looked like one needle was missing. He said it was a foot-long, quote, regulator with a very sharp point that every good furniture restorer would have. And police knew this tool was plenty big enough to have been the weapon that killed Frank Byrne. Newspapers immediately started running with the story, referring to the missing needle as the Gideon death needle, but the detectives would never find it. However, in their search for this other needle, they would find something else very unexpected in Joseph's shop, an unlicensed, loaded .38 caliber revolver hidden in a corner. Since Joseph had previously told police that he did not have a gun, they had now caught him in a lie. When one of the detectives phoned Assistant Chief Inspector Lyons with this news, he was elated. Now, Lyons said, they had Joseph Gideon right where they wanted him. Lyons ordered his men to start trailing Joseph wherever he went, just like the reporters were doing. They were going to allow Joseph to attend the funeral for his wife and his daughter, but that didn't mean he'd be going alone. Lyons told them to give Joseph a police escort so that a law enforcement officer was never more than an arm's length away. Several thousand people were waiting outside McCabe's funeral parlor when the police car carrying Joseph Gideon pulled up on Thursday afternoon. People were out on the sidewalk, while many more were draped over fire escapes, looking out windows, and even standing on the roof. Many hoped for a glimpse of the man suspected of killing Ronnie and Mary, and when Joseph stepped out of the police car, surrounded by 4 detectives, someone in the crowd shouted, "There he is!" But before anyone could lay a hand on Joseph, the detectives hustled him through the mob and into the chapel. There, Mary and Ronnie lay side by side in open caskets, surrounded by flowers, many from Ronnie's male admirers, as well as artists that she had worked with. The chapel was absolutely full, but only a handful of people actually knew the victims personally. People such as her ex-husband Bobby Flower, her boyfriend Lincoln Hauser, and her boyfriend's best friend, Stephen Butter, the last person to see Ronnie alive, aside from her killer. And there were a few people who had known the Gideons from the past, people like Bob Irwin, the young sculptor who had once boarded with Ronnie and Mary and asked Ronnie's older sister Ethel to marry him. Bob dabbed a tear from his eye with a handkerchief as the priest stepped up to the pulpit and began to speak. After the service was over, several of the men who had loved Ronnie kissed her as they passed her casket and openly wept. As for Ronnie's father, Joseph, He would keep his composure inside of the chapel, but when they all made their way out to the cemetery, he would break down in heavy sobs as he watched his daughter and ex-wife lowered into the ground. As he wept, his other daughter, Ethel, ran over and gave him a hug and cried with him. After the burial was over, police did not wait. They immediately grabbed Joseph and took him directly to the police station, where they would question him for another 6 straight hours, shaking and occasionally slapping Joseph the whole time. Despite Joseph's emotional display at the cemetery, detectives still strongly suspected he had killed his own family members, and if they pressed hard enough, he would confess. But without that missing needle that apparently Joseph could have used to kill the boarder Frank, or some other physical evidence linking Joseph to the crime in some way, prosecutors were not able to charge Joseph with murder. And when Joseph continued to deny that he was the killer, the police went to their plan B, and they charged him with illegal gun possession and put him in jail for that. By early Friday morning, April 2nd, less than a week after the murders, jail guards were taking Joseph's belt, necktie, and shoelaces to prevent him from committing suicide. Then they led him to his cell. Joseph's mind was numb as he sat on his jail cell cot, staring up at the bare light bulb that lit up the cell. The police had been questioning him relentlessly since he found the bodies of his wife and daughter 4 days earlier, and when detectives weren't grilling him, reporters followed his every move and shouted more questions. He had slept no more than maybe a few hours the whole time. For just a second, Joseph recalled last Sunday morning when he had been so excited to tell his daughters that he was getting back together with their mother. And now that was all gone. Then Joseph Gideon fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Assistant Chief Inspector Lyons was amazed at Joseph Gideon's stubbornness. He was the leading suspect in a triple murder, but Joseph refused to give an inch, even when police questioned him for hours and tried to scare the man with threats, shoves, or slaps across his face. Lyons was hopeful that Joseph would crack after a few days in jail, but he knew that his team could not put all their hopes in just one suspect. After all, the case they had against Joseph was far from airtight. And one of Lyons' best detectives had found what looked like a pretty good piece of evidence pointing toward a different suspect, one that made it look like Ronnie's ex-husband, Bobby Flower, was not who he appeared to be. The evidence found was Ronnie's diary. The entries from 4 years earlier in 1933, when she married Bobby Flower, oozed with love for him. She would do anything for Bobby. He was her soulmate. This tracked with what Bobby had told police. But in 1934, Ronnie's diary entries took a dark turn. She started writing about how Bobby seemed to be stalking her sister Ethel. Bobby was out of his head, she wrote, and she was afraid of him. The discovery suggested that Bobby Flower lied to the police about having, quote, no hard feelings for Ronnie. Now, Bobby looked like an obsessed and potentially dangerous liar. So, Detective Lyons went straight to Ronnie's sister Ethel. He figured she would be the best person to fill him in on the details of Bobby Flower's troubling past. When the detective arrived at Ethel's home in Queens, she greeted him cordially, but as Lyons started explaining that he wanted to hear more about how Bobby Flower stalked her, he watched as Ethel's face grew more and more puzzled. Finally, Ethel interrupted Lyons and just asked him, "What are you talking about?" And now it was Lyons' turn to be confused. He pulled out Ronnie's diary and began walking Ethel through some of the entries. At first, Ethel just stared at the little book uncomprehendingly. But when Lyons started reading her the passages about how Ronnie was afraid of Bobby and how Bobby wouldn't leave the family alone, a light suddenly clicked on inside of Ethel's brain. She put her hand on Lyons' arm to silence him, and with big, serious eyes, she said she knew exactly what Ronnie was talking about. Inspector Lyons walked out of Ethel's parlor, reeling from what she had just told him, but clear about what he needed to do. He now realized that he had been completely wrong in his interpretation of the diary. Now he had to learn more about Bobby, a lot more. He immediately dispatched one detective to Rockland State Psychiatric Hospital in upstate New York to pull Bobby's medical records. And when Lyons saw what the records contained, He and his colleagues became increasingly alarmed at the kind of person they were dealing with. Bobby had a history of mental breakdowns and sudden explosions of violence dating back to when he was just 14 years old. Once he tried to amputate his own penis and ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a year and a half. In fact, he had just been released when he had met Ronnie. There was no time to lose. They needed to talk to Bobby right away. So they went straight to the boarding house where he was staying. Bobby wasn't there, but his journal was. In it, he ranted and raved about Mary and Ronnie and how they were the reason his relationship with Ethel had broken up. Meanwhile, other detectives have been going from store to store in the New York City area, trying to find who sold the killer the gray suede glove that was left behind at the crime scene. Eventually, they found a young clerk in a J.J. Newberry's department store who remembered selling the gloves to a man just a few short weeks before. And when this young clerk described the man, it matched the description of Bobby perfectly. Inspector Lyons now realized he had a new primary suspect, someone with a clear motive to harm the Gideons and who had been physically linked to the crime scene. Lyons had Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon, released on bail from his firearms charges. He knew Joseph was not the killer, and early on Monday morning, April 5th, Lyons called a press conference to say that police now knew who committed the Easter Sunday massacre. And he passed out pictures of this new person to the gathered reporters. Soon, Bobby's face would be on the front page of newspapers all across America. Over the next 3 months, police heard dozens of rumors about where to find Bobby, but none of them panned out until late June, when a hotel employee in Cleveland reported that one of her coworkers looked exactly like Bobby. The man called himself Bob Murray, but she offered that it could be a fake name. Unfortunately, the woman decided to speak to this so-called Bob Murray person about his resemblance to the Bobby police were looking for, and it turned out it was Bobby. This startled him and gave him a warning that his cover was blown, and so Bob Murray jumped on the first Greyhound bus headed for Chicago, leaving the police empty-handed again. The media began to poke fun at the police's inability to catch their murderer, portraying him as this crafty fugitive who was capable of eluding a nationwide manhunt. But it was at this time, totally out of the blue, Bobby decided to just turn himself in. He figured that eventually he was going to get caught, so why not make some money first? He decided to call one of Chicago's big city newspapers, the Chicago Herald-Examiner, and sell his whole sordid story. On the evening of Saturday, June 26th, Bobby sat down with reporters to describe in detail his role in the triple murder 3 months earlier. But it would turn out this Bobby was not Bobby Flower, Ronnie's ex-husband. This was a very different Bobby. When Inspector Lyons had gone to Ethel's house with Ronnie's diary and started asking her about why Bobby Flower had begun stalking her, Ethel had been totally lost. Bobby Flower had been the love of Ethel's sister's life and had remained her friend until her death. But when Inspector Lyons started showing Ethel the actual passages of Ronnie's writing, it clicked for her and she realized Ronnie was talking about a different Bobby in her diary. Not Bobby Flower, but Bobby Irwin, the young sculptor who had once rented a room with the family and subsequently become infatuated with Ethel. And so the police had just confused the two Bobbies. Here's the real story of what happened to Ronnie and Mary Gideon and the boarder that was living with them, Frank Burns. Bobby Irwin was a down-on-his-luck 26-year-old sculptor who the Gideon family had taken on as a boarder in 1934, 3 years before the murders. Ronnie had been 17 at the time and was still recovering from her failed marriage to the other Bobby. Ethel had been 21 years old and was building a career as a secretary after her own marriage had just fizzled out. Both sisters at the time were avoiding romantic entanglements. But Bobby Irwin, who called himself Bob, even though Ronnie referred to him exclusively as Bobby in her diary, was a confident guy. He was sure that one day he would be recognized as one of the world's greatest sculptors. and he thought Ethel was totally beautiful. He had even convinced Ethel to sit for him so that he could create a sculpture of her head out of marble. And the end product, Ethel's whole family agreed, was totally striking. The sculpture version of Ethel was both beautiful and peaceful. Her eyes were closed as if she was sleeping. While Ronnie had always thought Bob Irwin was very creepy, Ethel had actually found him very talented and charismatic at first. He would take her to art museums where he would tell her all about the great masters and how his own artistic technique, something he called visualization, would lead him to the top as well. Ethel enjoyed the outings, but when Irwin asked her to marry him one summer night as they walked on the East River waterfront down by the piers, she was floored. Ethel told Irwin no and said that she was already engaged to an aspiring lawyer. This would be the man that Ethel would later marry. She said she still wanted to be friends with Irwin, but Irwin was totally heartbroken. After that, living in the same house was very uncomfortable, and so Irwin moved out later in 1934. That had been the end of the story as far as Ethel was concerned, but the story was not over for Bobby Irwin. By March 27, 1937, the day of the murders, Bobby Irwin lived at a boarding house a short walk from Ronnie and Mary's place. He still hadn't made it big as an artist. That very day, in fact, he had interviewed for another job that did not pan out. And he blamed the failures of his life on Ethel. He decided he couldn't live with her being married to someone else, so he sharpened his ice pick and set out for the Gideon home. His plan was actually just to kill Ethel, but his plan was flawed. He didn't realize that Ethel did not live there anymore. She had her own place with her husband in Queens. No one was home in the apartment when Irwin arrived, so he waited on the sidewalk until Mary Gideon arrived. Mary was not scared of Bob Irwin at all. Despite his obvious pining for her older daughter, he seemed like a nice guy. So she let him follow her up to the apartment. Mary was tired and not eager to visit, but she was polite as Irwin pulled out his sketchbook and began to draw her. In reality, he was stalling for time in hopes that Ethel would arrive. Then Mary's boarder, Frank Burns, came home and said hello before quickly retiring to his own bedroom. Eventually, Mary got tired of this long visit and just told Irwin that he had to leave. But Irwin said he was not going to leave until he saw Ethel. And so Mary said, okay, well, I'm going to get my boarder to throw you out. And that's when Irwin lunged for Mary's throat, squeezing as tight as he could and holding on even as she scratched his face repeatedly with her fingernails. And he kept choking Mary for 20 minutes until she was completely still. Then he stuffed her body under the bed in one of the smaller bedrooms. Irwin was astonished that Frank did not come out of his room during all the commotion, but he didn't have time to think about the boarder. He was there to kill Ethel. It occurred to Irwin that Ronnie might be the next person to come home, not Ethel, and he didn't want to kill Ronnie. It's true that she had disapproved of his relationship with Ethel, but he didn't hold a grudge about that. So he walked into the bathroom and grabbed a bar of soap and put it inside of a sock. If Ronnie came home first, he decided, he would just smack her in the face with the soap and hopefully knock her out. Irwin waited for nearly 2 hours in the dark of the Gideons' apartment until finally he heard Ronnie's voice after 3 a.m. speaking to her little dog. And when Ronnie finally came into the bedroom where Irwin was waiting, he wound up and smashed her on the left cheek with the bar of soap inside of the sock, shattering the soap into pieces. But to Irwin's surprise, this vicious blow seemed to have no effect on Ronnie. She just stood there. So Irwin grabbed her by the throat and pushed her onto the bed. He would say that he did not want to kill her at this point, but she was just making it so hard. He tried to disguise his voice, hoping she wouldn't recognize him, but she spoke to him by name as he was grappling with her, and she told him he was going to get in trouble if he didn't stop. And this was just too much for Irwin, and so he would furiously choke the life out of Ronnie and then rip off her clothes just to make the attack look as degrading as possible. By then, it was after 5 a.m., Ethel had not come back yet, and so Irwin knew he just needed to leave. But first, he knew he had to get rid of Frank, the boarder. Now, Frank never came out during the 2 attacks on the women, likely because he was almost deaf and didn't hear them. But Irwin thought he just could not take any chances, So he crept into Frank's room and began stabbing Frank in the face with his ice pick again and again and again. Finally, after Frank was dead, Irwin headed for the door, his only regret being that he did not get to kill Ethel. The Chicago Herald and Examiner paid Irwin $5,000 for his confession. It was the most money Irwin had ever made in his life, but the cops arrested him before he could spend it. New York prosecutors said they would be seeking the death penalty, but Irwin would plead guilty on the eve of his trial and would be sentenced to 139 years in prison instead. Bobby Irwin would live in mental hospitals until his death in 1975. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts, Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. You think you're safe when you're at home, but today's two stories prove you might not be. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Who's Out There? And it's about a woman's worst nightmare that unfolds at a cabin in the woods. And the second and final story you'll hear is called Denver Spider-Man, and it's about a very unsettling secret that was found inside of a locked house. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is looking to adopt a pet, tell them you just rescued a puppy and you'd love for them to take it. But don't tell them when you say puppy, you actually mean enormous saltwater crocodile. Okay, let's get into our first story called Who's Out There?
On the night of October 17, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late. It was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. She was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived full-time. And this was because just a few months earlier, when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property, a condo, and so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious, and so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk, but Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these two eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the two eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash. They turned around and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with two functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through. But because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there. And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin. And it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you. But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. Then she grabbed her phone and she was dialing 911 and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something. And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. And she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on. And she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend. And so she called her boyfriend. And as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night, from going out and seeing the mountain lion and then coming back in, hearing the sound and now hearing the footsteps on the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go. And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Let me look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police. And so the friend said, okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police. And so with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house, and she walked over to the sink, and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window, and there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe. Ada let out a relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, hey, sorry, there is no issue here. Don't call the police. But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point. Then her friend, who's still on the phone, is screaming like, what's going on? What's going on? And all Ada could think to do was yell out, there's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them. And the friend is screaming, I'm gonna call the police. And then the line goes dead. And Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's gonna do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around in her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, and with gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up. The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least 2 gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them, she wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there, it was silent. And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. I mean, there were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows, but after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing. And Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons, i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. I mean, there were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon, the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to drain a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go, she must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication. But after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog to clear her head and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert, which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her. And then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection, but again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state. And so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her. But again, it's just her reflection. And so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person and then didn't see anybody. And then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers. And then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground, and then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Denver Spider-Man.
On October 17, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital. And so they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, let's just be sure, let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked. They tried the other door, that was locked too. They looked in the windows, it was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door for them. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down. He has been bludgeoned to death. The police immediately draw their weapons and they're looking around the house thinking someone could still be here. And they clear the whole house and there's no one there. And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene was. Nothing in the house was vandalized, nothing in the house was stolen, and Phil himself was just a very modest, retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies, and so the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But then you gotta remember that when police first got there before they discovered his body, the house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. And so whoever was in there with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil enough to have a key of their own or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime when the obvious angles such as theft, vandalism, revenge have basically been crossed off. Not to mention there was virtually no evidence of who could have done this, with the exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. So there was nothing on it, no fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. 9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence and she hears the tapping and it's coming from the kitchen. And she thinks, oh, it's got to be a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the other side of the kitchen was a door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening. And out from behind comes this white hand that reaches for the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams and the hand retracts back into the space. And then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent again. She ran out of the house and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer is back. And they're looking all through the house and there's nothing. There's not even a sign of a break-in. And so the police go back to the housekeeper and to Miss Peters. They explain that we couldn't find anyone, but given the history of your house, we don't think it's safe for you to be in there. And so the housekeeper didn't go back and Miss Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be looked after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have 2 detectives that are outside this house watching it at all times. And so 2 detectives go and they're sitting outside and for a couple of days, they're not seeing anything. They're not hearing anything. And they decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house. They go upstairs. They look around. They don't see anything. They go back downstairs. And as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs. They both heard it, so they go upstairs and they start searching different rooms. And one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet, and past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps head first into the closet and grabs the foot of this mystery person who's crawling into a tiny little panel in the back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out, and he's yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in. They both grab this person, and they yank this person out. And they would describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall, but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty, it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Conies, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Conies moved in, he had fallen on hard times, he was sleeping in alleyways, and as it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend, Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe an opportunity to crash at his house for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital visiting his wife who had a broken hip, and so the house was vacant. And Conies saw an opportunity and he broke in. And at first, his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take, that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little, almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You'd have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering headfirst in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult. So you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Conies saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And so he went around the house gathering supplies between blankets and food and water, and he filled his tiny little space. And then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door again, made sure everything looked the way it was when he showed up. And he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks, Phil never noticed a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Conies would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, and then go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's wiring system and stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into the cubby with him, attached it to the new wiring, and he got to listen to the news so he didn't feel so isolated from the outside world. But about a month later, Conies leaves his little spot to go downstairs because he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going through the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, "What are you doing in my kitchen?" In a panic, Conies grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it where it is. He goes in the fridge, he gets some more food and drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives. He would follow the investigation of Phil Peters' death on his radio, curled up inside of Phil Peters' house. Conies was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years."
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballin podcast, as well as Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballin Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
So today's story is a very creepy one. In fact, it's so unsettling at times that you're very likely going to think it's just fake. But there was a pretty incredible discovery that was made in the early 1900s that very likely means this story is true. But before we get into that incredible campfire story, as you can see, I'm literally sitting by a campfire. And honestly, it was just because, what I sort of do is I tell scary campfire stories a lot of the times. But I never actually sit by a fire. And so we decided, why not literally make a campfire and tell a spooky story by it? And if this vibe is something you guys like, I'm more than happy to do more of these because this sort of breaks it up. It's cool. It sort of adds a new flavor to the channel. And so let us know if you enjoy this vibe and we'll do more. And I think that generally speaking, when we do campfire, literal campfire stories, I'm going to lean towards the stories that are of the spookier variety. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come to your campfire and cook some s'mores with you. But don't tell them you've secretly put firecrackers in their marshmallows. Okay, let's get into today's story. Hundreds of years ago, there was this young indigenous warrior who was on his way to the center of his village. And his village was located in this heavily forested rolling hills area of modern-day Richland County, Wisconsin. He was a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation. It was this indigenous tribe, and that's where they called home. And as this young warrior, this strong, brave young man is walking towards the village center, he had been called there by his tribal chief. He sort of had an idea of why he was being called there. And sure enough, when he got to the village center and he sees his tribal chief, who's standing there with 9 of the other strongest and bravest men of the tribe, this warrior knew, his hunch was correct. So 2 days earlier, 3 teenage boys that were members of this tribe, they had gone out deer hunting in the wilds right outside of their village. Again, this is a heavily forested, beautiful rolling hills area. And these teenagers had not come back. They had just been gone now for 48 hours, and their respective families were worried. And they had been, telling the tribal chief that they really needed to send out a search party for them, but the chief had sort of held off, in part because it wasn't entirely uncommon for hunters, even young hunters, to go out for a couple of days at a time. But the family, they had a bad feeling about it. And so finally, the tribal chief relented 2 days in, and he was calling a search party together to go look for these young men. And so the warrior who's walked into the village center here, he was being asked by the tribal chief to lead this search party effort. He was going to be in charge of these 9 other men. And so, the warrior, in truth, he sort of felt like it was overkill to put together this huge search party for these teenagers that in his mind he really did think they were just fine, but he didn't want to undermine the tribal chief, and so he said, of course, I'll go do it. And so the warrior, along with the 9 other strong, brave members of the tribe, they gather up some weapons and some food and water because they didn't know how long the search was going to take. They said goodbye to the members of the village, and then they exited the village in the same direction that basically all the hunters would go when they would go on hunting expeditions. There was like sort of a well-worn path that led out into the wilds of the forest. And so the warrior, who's again leading the search party, he was a skilled hunter himself. And as he's walking along this well-worn trail, he quickly found the tracks of these teenage boys. So they identified the tracks. And, right away, the warrior's thinking, this is going to be, no big deal. We're going to follow these tracks. We're going to find the kids. They probably are out camping somewhere. We'll give them a stern talking to and bring them back home, and that'll be that. But, as they're following the tracks along the well-worn trail, eventually the tracks, they deviate and they leave the trail and they start kind of veering off into not really uncharted territory, but certainly areas that were not necessarily known for good hunting. This tribe they were prolific hunters, and so they knew this area extremely well, and they really had the designated areas that were the best. And so already they're seeing that these boys, they're doing something different, or they're doing something that's not advantageous for hunting. But either way, they're following these tracks that are going for miles and miles just into the wild. And also, as they're moving along here, they start to notice that there's no point at which the boys stopped. There's no, tracks that indicated they came to a stop and rested, or, stood still and tried to kill a deer or something. It was like they were just on a mission, hiking deep into the wilds. And so, the warrior's keeping a lot of these insights to himself, and he's just following the tracks. But after hours of this, when they still have not found the boys, they eventually found themselves at the top of this ravine. And as they're looking down into it, they realize that they've gone so far, not only away from their village, but so far off, the beaten paths that they were familiar with from all their hunting, that they knew this was an area that they really had never been to before, and they had no idea, what was down in the ravine or what was beyond. I mean, this is sort of uncharted territory for the warrior and the search party. But what they did know is that the tracks of these teenage boys continued down into this ravine, and so down the ravine they went. And then when they got to the bottom of this steep ravine, the trees kind of cleared out a little bit, and right in front of them, where the tracks continued, is this opening to a cave. And it's so dark inside that they really have no sense of how far back it goes or anything, but they see the tracks that they're following of the teenagers lead into that cave. But there are no tracks coming back out again. And so, presumably, the teenage boys, for reasons totally unknown, have hiked all the way out here, have gone into that cave, and that's where they are. But again, from the outside, the warrior and the others, they can't see these teenagers. And so naturally, the group, they walk up to the mouth of the cave, and even up close, it's starting to get a little bit dark outside, but there's still some daylight. Even up close, they can't see very far into the cave. It's just very dark. I mean, it's clearly big enough inside that you could walk for a great distance, or a pretty decent distance, but at some point it must sort of bend off and go in a different direction, and they can't see the teenagers inside of there. And so the warrior at this point, has a level of apprehension here, because he doesn't know this cave. He doesn't know this area. He doesn't know what's happened to these teenagers. He doesn't know if they're okay or not in there. He doesn't know if there's a predator or something inside of this cave. And so what he does is he decides, okay, I'm going to send 2 of my men of the search party in there to scout this out, and the rest of us will stay out here and just wait. And so he designates the 2 who say okay, and they go into the cave. And so the warrior and the 7 other men that he's with are just standing outside of the cave, and they're listening intently, because these 2 men that are going in, they're calling out the names of the missing teenagers. They're yelling, and all they can hear from the outside is just the sound of the 2 men yelling. They're not hearing any response from the teenagers. It's just quiet inside of the cave. And again, from the warrior and the other search party members' perspective, they can only see the 2 men that have gone in for a little while, and then they kind of disappear into the darkness, but they can still kind of hear them. As they're calling out for the boys' names, they're calling and calling. And then around the same time that the warrior and the others he was with lost sight of the 2 men that went in looking for the boys, at the same time that they lost sight of them, they stopped making noise. It's like the cave went completely silent. And so for about 5 minutes or so, the warrior and the others, they're just kind of anxiously waiting, what's going on in there? But it's completely silent. 10 minutes goes by, and then 15, and it is dead silence. There's nothing coming out of the cave. It's just eerily quiet. And so the warrior at this point, he tells the others to stay put, and he just steps a little ways into the cave, just enough that, he was sort of inside the entrance of the cave. And he began calling out the name of the 2 men who went in. That now they're missing as well. He's calling their names out. As he's yelling their names, it's sort of echoing through what appears to be a vast cave system. But there's no response. At least not at first. If there had been no response, it would have told him at least, okay, maybe they're hurt, or they're too far away, I can't hear them. But instead, he did get a sort of response, but he couldn't make any sense of it. He heard what sounded like a wailing sound coming from deep inside of this cave, way, way deep inside, this wail that at first it sounded like one voice, and then it sounded like multiple voices kind of layered on top of each other. And then, with this sudden realization, the warrior understood what he was hearing. It wasn't a cry. He was hearing a chant. And it was a very particular chant, very particular to the Ho-Chunk Nation. It was the chant that warriors did before they died. It was literally known as the death song. And as soon as the main warrior is hearing the death song being chanted deep inside of this cave, the other men he's with, these 7 others who know exactly what that song is, they all sprung forward and said, what do? We have to go in. There's something wrong. And before the lead warrior could tell them what to do, 6 of the other men just charged into the cave, chasing down their brothers, because they believe they're about to die. They would never be singing that song, chanting that song, if they weren't in real danger. And so the lead warrior and the one other guy that stayed back, they stayed put, just kind of waiting to see what would happen. And they're listening to these 6 others, go running into the cave, and they disappear into the darkness, and they're yelling over and over again for their brothers, and they can still hear that chanting, that death song reverberating off the walls. But then suddenly the cave goes silent again. The chanting stops. All the calling from the 6 men that went in, that stopped too. It's silent again. And it's just the lead warrior still in the mouth of the cave next to the one guy. Now they're scared. And they're just listening for anything, but it's just completely quiet. And then, before the lead warrior or the other guy could do anything, that rhythmic chanting began again, the death song. But now it was clearly far more than just a couple of voices. It was this rhythmic, loud, multiple voices layered on top of each other deep inside of this cave, chanting the death song over and over again. At this point, the lead warrior and the other, he had a decision to make. Deep down, he knew it was his responsibility, his moral responsibility here. It was code to go in there, and if you have to, sacrifice yourself to get these guys out of there. But he also thought, logically, something bad is happening inside of this cave, and if me and the other go in there right now, we're not coming out again, and no one's going to know what happened. There will be no saving. Everyone's just going to perish. And so even though it sort of went against every fiber in his body, the lead warrior, as this death song is reverberating off the walls, he and the other, they turned and they ran miles and miles all the way back to their village. And by the time they got there, it was dark out, and they, breathlessly told the tribal chief what had happened. And he said, tomorrow, first thing in the morning, first light, we're going to go back to that cave and we're going to get those boys out of there. And so sure enough, the next morning at first light, the tribal chief, the lead warrior, and the other man that he was with, the two that had come running back from the cave, they, along with about 100 other members of this village, they banded together and out into the wild they went, retracing these steps all the way back to the cave. And when they got there, the cave was still, it was quiet, there was still light outside, but there was no sign that anybody had come back out of the cave. All the tracks that went into the cave still had not come back out again. So they believe at this point, still, their loved ones are in this cave. They don't know what's happened to them, but they're in there and they have to figure out what's going on. Now at this point, the lead warrior didn't really know what the plan was. I mean, he remembered what happened the day before, and really anybody who went into the cave was seemingly swallowed whole. And so he didn't really have a sense of how they were going to do this. But the tribal chief, he spoke up and he said, I have a plan. We're not going to break up into groups and go into this cave onesie-twosie and see what happens. We're going to go as one big group. We're going to lock hands in one big line so that we're always connected. Never let go of the person's hands that are left and right of you. And the lead warrior and the other man, they're going to lead us into the cave in the direction of where they heard their brothers when they went in there. And we're all going to trail, and as one, we're going to walk into this cave until we find our missing people, and we're going to get them out of there. And so the lead warrior thought this was actually a brilliant idea. We'll all be together. We'll be holding on to each other. Nothing can happen to us this way. And so the lead warrior was second in line. The man who was leading the line was basically the other guy he was with, the two that had run back. He was the other guy. So he's in front. The lead warrior is second. He's locked hands with this guy. And then behind him is basically about 100 other people, all, holding on to each other's hands, one big line. And when they were ready, the lead warrior and the man in front of him, they began moving into this cave. And so into the cave they went. And as they're walking, they can tell pretty quickly that the cave, it sort of turns to the right. You have to walk in, maybe 50 or so feet into the cave, but then it sharp rights. And so there's enough light coming in that you can basically walk all the way up to that turn. But then when the lead warrior and the man in front of him made that sharp right and they began walking that way, it was utterly pitch black. No light reached that section of the tunnel. But, they're leading the line, and so they're still just moving along, and the whole line's following them pretty slowly. And as they're walking, the lead warrior, it's like he kept trying to blink his eyes to just try to capture anything, but he can't see anything. It is pitch black, and he's just gripping onto the men in front and behind him as tight as he can to show solidarity, like we're here together, we're going to be okay. And as they're walking, the lead guy kept calling out the names of the many men at this point that were lost in this cave, but there's no response. And as they're walking and shuffling along, again, they can't see anything, the walls are getting tight. They hear from somewhere deep in the cave the death song. The chant begins low and slow, and it begins to build and gets louder and louder and louder. And at this point, because they're all locked together, you can't really get out very quickly. They're well into the cave at this point. They can't see anything, and it's like the walls are echoing, and it's booming in their chest, this chant that's only done when you're on the brink of death. And so as they're walking along, the lead warrior, he's trying to grip as hard as he can to the man in front and behind him, showing them, keep going, it's gonna be okay. But then he felt the hand of the man in front of him, the line leader, go slack. And before he could grab it again, the man's hand was out of his. And he's reaching out in front of him, and he can't see him, but he can't feel him either. It was like he vanished. And so now the lead warrior, he's the front of the line. He has no idea what's going on. And he wants to just stop and turn and leave. It's getting so overwhelming. And he's about to do that, but he just feels like there's this force pulling him deeper into the cave. And then before he can do anything else, he opens his mouth and he begins to chant the death song. At the same time this is happening, deep inside of this cave, the tribal chief, along with a couple of others who had not joined the line, they were still outside of the cave. They've heard something going on in the cave, but it's dull. They can't really hear too much. There's something going on, but there's 100 people walking into the cave. They presumed there'd be noise. But suddenly, there was this obvious commotion, panic, erupting from deep inside of the cave. And before he knew it, all these people are coming running out of the cave, scared to death. They come bombing out of the cave. And at this point, the tribal chief knows something horrible's happened, and so he rounds everybody up. He does a head count and realizes over a dozen people are gone. They did not come back out again. And the cave that minutes ago was full of this death song and chaos and panic is silent once again. At this point, the tribal chief sort of designated that it must be the case that there's something evil inside of this cave. There's an evil spirit, there's something in this cave that is taking our people and they're vanishing. They're being swallowed whole by this cave. It's evil. And so from that moment, he forbid anyone from the tribe of ever stepping foot in this cave again. We cannot lose anyone else. Our best bet is to go back to the village and hope that these men, these brave warriors, eventually find their way out again. And so the tribal chief and the rest of these devastated villagers, back to the village they went. And over the next couple of days and weeks, no one came out of that cave. And as weeks turned into months, it's like the villagers, they couldn't really move on because they were not able to collect their loved ones' bodies or get any sort of closure. It's just this unbelievable mystery, this terrifying mystery that had ripped the entire tribe apart. And so eventually, after months and months had passed, and still no one has any idea what's happened, no one's come out of that cave, the tribal chief finally just said, we are going to basically board up the cave. We're going to cover it with rocks. Effectively, it is now a tomb, and that'll be that. No one will ever go back in. This cave will never claim another life. So that's what they did. They used huge boulders, and they completely blocked the entrance, and that was it. Now, that was the story that the Ho-Chunk Nation passed down for generations about what happened to all those people, the warriors and the teenagers and all these people, that they were swallowed alive by this cave. And over many years, many members of this tribe, that heard the story, they didn't know what to make of it. Is it real? Is it just folklore? We don't know. But then in 1930, so hundreds of years later, a chilling discovery was made. So in 1930, there was this guy named Paul Seifert, who in Richland County, Wisconsin, he was sort of a well-known antique dealer. And something he really liked to do was he would go hiking in the forests of Richland County, the rolling hills, and he would look for indigenous artifacts that were left behind from, like the Ho-Chunk Nation and other indigenous tribes that were in the area. Sometimes he'd find, an arrowhead or something on the ground or pottery or whatever it was. But he liked hiking, he liked being out in nature, and this was something he would look for. And, if he found something good enough, he could sell it in his antique shop. And so he's out walking the hills of Richland County, and he's well off the trail. He's sort of out in the sticks, and he finds this ravine. And he walks down the ravine, and it comes to this clearing of sorts. And he notices on the other side of the ravine, the slope that goes back up, he saw what looked to be almost like a memorial or something, like a stack of rocks that looked sort of out of place. And there was like moss and grass that sort of grown over it. But he immediately identified that there's a mound of something here that looks a little bit out of place. And so he walks over and he begins sort of pulling off some of the rocks. And he realizes pretty quickly that this was put here on purpose, this pile of rocks, these boulders and all this was put here on purpose. And so after pulling off enough of these rocks, he realizes that there is a cave on the other side. Now, it would take quite a bit of work to pull off enough rocks that he could actually get himself inside of this cave, but eventually he did. And once he was inside of this cave, the same cave the Ho-Chunk Nation had dealt with hundreds of years earlier, he's like, wow, like this cave, it's been blocked off. I wonder what's inside of here. Maybe there are incredible indigenous artifacts inside of here. And so feeling really motivated to explore this cave, he left, went back, got some basic supplies, including a lantern, and then he came back another day, because this is well off the beaten path. No one's going to stumble upon this. And into the cave he went. And so he's in this cave, and he walks, all the way to the end where it banks to the right. He turns, and he starts walking. And the ceiling of this cave begins to come down, and it's getting really tight on him, but he's so excited to see what's in here because he knows this has been blocked off on purpose. There's something in here. And so eventually the ceiling gets so low that he's crawling with his lantern. And right as he's thinking, this is so narrow, I don't know if I can fit, he pulls himself under this one really low section and everything just opens up. It's like this grand cathedral in the middle of this cave. And he holds out his light. He kind of stands up and he holds out his light, and it's just this massive, massive space. And right away, he sees something on the ground. There are all these neat rows of human skeletons, and they're all positioned the same way. It's like they're kneeling with their hands over their head, like they're bowing, all of them. You couldn't even count how many skeletons are all positioned here, right in the middle of this cavern. And so he's looking at all of these bodies, and he's gasping, he can't believe it, and he brings the light sort of in the direction that all these bodies are aiming towards, all the bodies are praying towards. And carved into the rock is this enormous chair, like a throne. And there was nothing on the throne. And Paul, when he saw that and all these bodies and just the fact that he's deep inside of this cave, he was spooked. Even though there could have been a sea of artifacts he could have taken, he just turned and he bolted. He crawled out of there and he left the cave as fast as he could. And the reason we know about the story is because Paul, after this experience, he got in touch with a local newspaper. It's called the Milwaukee Journal. And he spoke to a journalist about what he saw. And they reported it. They reported that he found these skeletons in this throne, and it's inside of this cave that was blocked off. And there's allusions to the story of the Ho-Chunk Nation. It's like this totally cryptic story. But in 1930, and even still today, we're left with a couple of distinct questions. One, what happened to all these people? And two, who or what was sitting on that throne?
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Time slowed down as I'm watching this grenade hit my shoulder. As it hit my shoulder, I actually actively thought, okay, you're about to die. There's no escaping it. And I was told I was maybe 30 seconds from death.
From my experience growing up, death is a pretty taboo topic. Now I'm around people talking about death all the time. Are you a big cemetery person yourself?
I don't know if I'm a big cemetery person.
That's a weird way to phrase it, yeah.
I do think about death. I want to do more with my life with the second chance. I do have that feeling, but it's not nearly as pronounced as I don't have a fear of death. On today's episode of Storytime with Mr. Ballin, we have a truly unique guest. You'll see in a minute what I mean when I say unique, because what they do, I didn't even know this was a thing, but it definitely is, because when she made her first post back in 2021 about sort of what she does, it went super viral. And sure enough, what she's discovered really is a phenomenon, but it's one that I promise most of you have never heard of. It's fascinating. Not only do we cover what she does, but it also sort of led us to this really deep discussion around death, mortality, and what happens when you die. I didn't expect the conversation to go that way, but that's the way it went, and it was great. It was an amazing conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Also, side note, my voice is terrible, but I was just so excited to get this interview in that we decided to push forward. So I apologize for my voice, but it's because I love all you fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And so without further ado, let's get into.
I am Rosie Grant, aka Ghostly Archive, and this is Storytime with Mr. Ballin.
All right, so Rosie Grant, I know what you do. I mean, what you do is one of the more unique things I've seen, certainly on the internet or just at large. It's you find recipes on gravestones and you make those recipes and you post about it online and you get in touch with the families and the relatives, and it's gone super viral. But I guess now I've explained what you do, but tell me how the heck you got here. How did you start doing that?
Well, I got started with this when I was trying to become a librarian. I was living in DC and I went to library science school. It was pretty much, I think, 2020 is when I started the program. In 2021, I had to do an internship. So it was early days of COVID. I all libraries were closed to new people. And so I interned at the only place that I could find, which was in a cemetery. So of course, yeah.
Yeah.
When you're trying to become a librarian.
internship.
Yeah, really. Yeah, they were busier than ever. And I mean, it was wonderful. And I should say my parents are both ghost tour guides. So like being in a cemetery wasn't that weird from things that I did growing up as a kid. Are you a big cemetery person yourself?
I don't know if I'm a big cemetery person.
That's a weird way to phrase it, yeah. Have you gone to cemeteries?
I frequented cemeteries.
You frequented.
Yeah.
I think I was very similar going into this. I frequented cemeteries. But I didn't know anything about the death industry or how that worked. And so I got to basically do digital archives with their archivist, and I would take photos and I'd go on these site visits to geolocate different gravestones. And I made this sort of online tour of the cemetery. And in the process, I started a TikTok of like, what's it like to intern at a cemetery? And pretty much everything came from there. I didn't learn about my first gravestone recipe until maybe 5 or 6 months after starting the account. It was just at first different gravestones and memorials. And then I found a Spritz cookie recipe on a gravestone in Brooklyn, New York.
And so you actually brought me some of your Spritz cookies.
Yeah.
And in full candor, I've already tried them and they're quite good.
Yeah.
And actually, as I'm tasting this, so did you know it was like a thing that people literally engrave recipes on gravestones?
Did not know it was a thing. I was surprised to find one. So like in the early days of it, they're good, right? They're like
They're
nice
awfully
and buttery. Yeah.
Really good.
In the early days of TikToking about different memorials, it was just different interesting gravestones. In Baltimore, there's like a Ouija gravestone, and in other places, there's like these Edgar Allan Poe has an interesting gravestone. So I was just featuring like unusual gravestones around DC. And so when it came to gravestone recipes, I learned about Naomi, who has this Spritz cookie recipe in Brooklyn. And I thought, like, what do those cookies taste like? They're on a gravestone. And like, it didn't just say like she liked baking or cooking was important to her. It like literally is the ingredients to make her recipe. So when I posted it on TikTok, it went like super viral, like overnight. Like NPR called me the next day and they're like, what's going on with this? And I was like, I have no idea. Like I've just learned about this woman. And even more so, the number one comment that I was getting from people, of course, people were like, this is so interesting. I've never heard about this. But even more so, I was getting comments like, my mom died a few years ago and I make her cake every year when I miss her. Or my dad died 10 years ago and I make his chili every Sunday and it helps me feel like he's closer to me. And it was just these like really personal food stories of like using food and death, and they blended together when they miss their person. And I was like, there's something here. Like, what is this of like connecting to the lost loved ones through food? And so I was learning more about Naomi when I learned about a woman named Kay, who has a fudge recipe. And then I learned about a woman named Maxine, who has Christmas cookies. And that kind of started the journey of learning about gravestone recipes.
You speak about these folks like you clearly have put a lot of time into learning about them, not just their recipe. And it seems like you also have a pretty deep connection with some of the family. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say, and through the process of it, it didn't begin that way. And the first 3 folks who I learned about, they were already very viral and online before I came along. Facebook groups had posted about them, lots of online cemetery groups in the world, and they had all featured these 3 over the years. But then as I started learning about more folks, and I think when I was at about 8 recipes, families started reaching out and they were starting to say like, I thought my mom was the only one crazy enough to do something like this, like try her cheese dip recipe. And so from there I was like, oh, I need to start interviewing people. And so it became a community archive in the sense of like, I would reach out to the family members. I have this crazy Google map of like where each of the gravestone markers are. I have this insane Google Doc. I have a spreadsheet. This is the library science in me of like the data behind each person, but then with each that would be oral histories. So I would interview the families. It would just be like, who is this person? Who's the person behind the recipe? What does this recipe mean to your family still? And things like that. And I mean, it's at this point now, it's also included traveling. I visited all of the recipes in North America. So I went up to Nome, Alaska, and down to Florida and New Orleans and Nova Scotia and the Midwest and up and down California. And New York State actually has the most gravestone recipes. So I've been all around New York for that reason. Yeah.
And so you were studying for your library sciences degree. My mom actually got her library sciences degree.
Get out.
I'm very familiar with how technically difficult it is to get one of those degrees.
That's incredible. Oh,
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah,
Is she a librarian or does she work anywhere in that?
She's also a writer, and she pioneered writing our podcast.
Oh
She's one of our
my
writers.
gosh, I'm obsessed with that.
Yeah, so
yay, librarians.
yeah, the degree is gnarly. But so did you?
Yeah.
You have this cemetery internship. You go viral with this really unique idea, like basically posting about these Spritz cookies from Naomi. How do you go from, well, what I'm doing is I'm getting my library sciences degree on a course to be one of the most like introverted, like quiet, private lives, being a librarian, to now you have this amazing new book called To Die For, a cookbook of gravestone recipes. This is incredible. Is this all the recipes that you've done?
All the recipes with all the family approvals. There's a few more that I haven't gotten approvals from the family yet, but these were the ones that I was able to connect with, visit, photographed, and of course learn their stories. So that was it did become a lot more public and social than I think I was expecting.
Yeah, so like, how have you responded to this new life path, or do you feel like you're still sort of like, what's going on?
I think every time I find a new gravestone recipe, I'm like, and that's it. The door is shut. I have no more people to research, but now it's kind of turned into this, it's grown almost beyond me. I'm getting phone calls. Some of the folks featured in this book, they learned about it from the project. So they had seen a TikTok, and then their parent, they decided to do a gravestone recipe for their parent. One of the women who was featured in it, when I connected with her daughter, and I was like, hey, your mom has this gravestone recipe, this really good kosher vernishkas. She's buried in New Jersey. And I was like, can I include your mom in the project? And she was like, well, what are you exactly planning to do with this information? And I was like, well, I'm working on a book. Could I include your mom in the book? And she's like, are you the right person to be doing this? And I was like, I had this whole moment, and I was like, I'm just a library science person. Maybe I'm not the right person to be doing this. And I should say I didn't really play up the TikTok side because I wanted to show my other credentials. And I was like, well, I was an English major and I was a creative writing minor and I love food writing and all of this stuff. And so she's like, well, there's this TikToker who does gravestone recipes and I think she should be doing this.
That's me.
And I was like, yeah, exactly. I'm like, she should be doing this. Also, that's me. Yeah.
What has this experience of becoming the go-to person to, talk to these families and make these recipes and sort of connect with the dead in a sense, what has that done for, I guess, your relationship with mortality?
That's a great question. And I would be curious to hear what your kind of entry point is, because death, from my experience growing up, death is a pretty taboo topic. I think my parents are ghost tour guides, and we go to cemeteries all the time. We love visiting cemeteries, and death is still really taboo. And my parents don't want to talk about where do they want to be buried? How do they want to be remembered? It's just a very uncomfortable topic because it implies that we will die, which we will. Well, unfortunately, yeah, exactly. And I think growing up, I remember my first awareness of that I would die and my loved ones would die. I went to my great grandmother's funeral. I think I was maybe 7. And right afterwards, my cousins were planning a trip to Disney World and they invited me and I said no, because I was like, but what if my parents die? So I didn't go to Disney because I was so scared of my parents just randomly dying while I was gone. But I was really freaked out by it as a kid and I was so consumed. I remember reading books and just I was so freaked out by it. And I think moving into adulthood, I had a girlfriend die in college we were English majors together, and I just did not know how to process it, didn't know how to talk about it with friends, and my whole little friend group who this girl was a part of just kind of fell apart. And so we had no idea how to process it and talk about it. So then flash forward to now where I feel like I'm around people talking about death all the time, and it honestly has taught me that it gets easier the more you talk about it, which is kind of why I like gravestone recipes in the sense of it's easier to talk about food, to be well, what meals do you like? How do you want to be remembered? You make really good cookies. Do you want that to be served at your funeral? Maybe you don't even want a gravestone. Maybe you want your ashes scattered somewhere that's important to you. Maybe you like this song and you want this played at your funeral, or you want this on your deathbed. So there's just a lot of things, and the idea that it's healthy to talk about these things. This is also, I should say, based in the death positive movement. Are you familiar with
I
this?
saw a reference to that in one of your interviews.
Oh,
I'm
no
not
way.
familiar with.
I wasn't either until this. It started in hospice. Basically, this idea that people and society are better off if we talk about these things. It's not like, yay, death, like, woohoo, we're
Right.
gonna die someday.
Yeah.
But it's healthy if we like talk about these things with loved ones of like, how do you want to be remembered? And again, I think food to me is a much easier access point to it rather than like this sense of like failure or whatever that we'll all die. So yeah, in any case, I think I feel a little bit better about it, but I think I still have a journey to go for getting more comfortable with my own mortality.
I'll tell you a quick story about my own feelings around mortality. So I was in the military before I started telling spooky stories on the internet.
Hell yeah.
And
A natural crossover.
Yeah, it is. And when I was overseas in Afghanistan, we effectively were ambushed, and a grenade actually detonated
Holy
quite
cow.
literally next to me.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and in fact, when the grenade came over the wall, it's nighttime. I'm on night vision, and so the way there was a drone overhead that was shining down on us with infrared light. You can only see it on night vision, so like to the world it's pitch black, but in this circle of light that we're in, we can see.
Whoa.
And on night vision, the light began to strobe, which is actually a targeting system. It means the drone is saying we're going to attack here. It was a mistake, but I'm basically in a strobe light. Okay, suddenly I'm in a strobe light as this grenade comes over the wall. It's like chaos, and the grenade kept coming in and out of focus because the light cast on it over and over. And this took a matter of less than a second for the grenade to literally, with
just this flashing thing coming.
it was like time slowed down as I'm watching this grenade like appear, disappear, it hit my shoulder. And as it hit my shoulder, I actually actively thought, okay, you're about to die. There's no escaping it. And I remember thinking what a bummer it was that it was going to detonate at this point and that my head will be blown off, which is really graphic. But I really
But
was
it's
just,
like you experienced that, yeah.
and I was thinking about how I won't be able to, like my mom won't be able to like see me again. And I was like, oh my God, like that was the pain. It wasn't I'm going to die. It was my poor mom. And then as the grenade is falling in this fraction of a second, it reached my torso. And again, it's just falling, the speed it takes to fall, but everything really did slow down. And I thought, okay, I'm still definitely going to die, but at least my face will be intact. And my mom will see me again. And then by the time it reached the ground, I was like, oh, it might just hit my legs, blow my legs off. I might live. This is pretty good, right?
Shoot.
And so it detonates, and I was with 6 other guys that I was in the unit with, and it was honestly horrific. I mean, everybody's down, there's a gunfight going on, and I basically was immobile. And I was literally under fire, dragged out to this other alleyway where I'm not safe. There are combatants literally firing rockets and just shooting arbitrarily in our direction. I'm watching tracer rounds, which you can see every period, like when you shoot like 5 rounds in a row, one shows up. It's like a bright light. I'm seeing tracer rounds skipping all over the place. And the people we've just attacked who are attacking us, they're like 15 feet away. At any moment, they could come into this alleyway, and I'm alone in this alleyway because they're dealing with this huge contact down there. And so I have this like, I've been mortally wounded. I can't pull my tourniquets to stop the bleeding off of my kit because I just was so weak from blood loss. And so I can't take off the life-saving equipment. I know I'm dying, and it's not sad. This is where I'm getting to with mortality, and I tell people this story for this reason. I was not sad. It was shockingly matter of fact. I was sitting in an alleyway anticipating that I'm like, okay, I should have died down there at the contact site. Now I'm bleeding to death for sure. Or if I don't bleed to death, the people that we are in the middle of a gunfight with are for sure going to come over here and kill me. And so it was just factual. Like my brain processed it as like, wow, you are about to die. Hard stop. This is in 2014. I was 26 years old.
Oh my God.
And the thought that was going through my mind, in addition to the matter of factness, as my vision actually went completely gone, I couldn't hear anymore. So I'm like in this black void, but I'm still alive. All I thought about was my wife, Amanda, and we had made the decision to wait on having children before I went on this deployment. I'm like, oh, we'll have time, right? And I was like, man, like, I guess we don't have time. And I pictured her on the couch in our home in Virginia, just like with our cats, just watching TV, and like probably tonight someone's gonna tell her that I'm dead. And what I also thought was like, we don't have kids. She's young. She'll be devastated, no doubt, but what's going to happen here is time's going to go on and she's going to marry somebody else and have a different life. She'll respect me and honor me, but I'm gone. And then I also thought, I wonder what the newspaper will say about my death. No, not the story, just will they write Jonathan Allen, like killed in action Jonathan Allen, or killed in action John Allen. It was just like, I wonder if it'll say my full name or John Allen.
These are the things that you're
That's
going
it.
in through of like fire and everything, one near-death
Madness.
experience after another. That's so crazy.
And so the one guy who was not gravely injured on this contact, there was like 7 of us. He was our medic, sort of luckily.
Oh my gosh.
He's up for all sorts of awards. He came over to me and I could feel him. I couldn't hear or see him, and he put tourniquets on me, and they literally whisked me out, carried me out to a helicopter, and they saved my life. And
Amazing.
so I survived. Obviously,
Yeah.
I survived. Here I am.
Not a ghost.
But the reality for me is that, of course, there was, I had to process this thing, which I really didn't do a good job of. For a while, I actually ignored it. I just never talked about it. It took me 4 years after coming out of Afghanistan to just talk to the guy who saved my life. We're at the same team. We see each other in the halls. We didn't talk.
Because you have to
for years.
recognize that. Yeah.
But eventually, when I sort of came around to maybe the death positive side of things, I was like, I need to look at this. I looked at it as like a tremendous gift. And it wasn't that like now I have a second chance. Definitely that. The lasting impression it gave me was right now, we are living. And we don't think about it. You don't wake up and think, I better make sure my heart beats and I gotta breathe, circulate my blood.
You're
You
like,
just
I got
live.
100 emails to whatever. Yeah.
You just live.
Yeah.
But what I felt in my, almost certainly had I not been rescued, I would have died. I was in the final stages. I was told I was maybe 30 seconds from death.
Oh my God.
You're ready to die, you just don't know it. And it's, for me, I was very badly injured. I didn't feel anything. If anything, it was just sort of like, yeah, this is it. That's it. I'm thinking about my name spelling in the newspaper or something. Yeah. And what it did for me is it made death feel not scary.
Wow.
And so I want to do more with my life with the second chance. I do have that feeling, but it's not nearly as pronounced as I don't have a fear of death.
Yeah.
I simply know death is coming, and I do think about death. It informs a lot of my decision making. Like whatever I want to do, it's timed against how much time I think I have, but it's not sad, it just is.
Yeah.
And I think people are so weary or scared of like, what's going to happen when you die? And granted, I don't really know, but I got close enough. To me, it was like, you're ready to die, you just don't know it, as messed up as that really is.
Yeah. It's like hard because I think I don't want to focus on it on the day to day of the fact that like I'll wake up and being like, oh yeah, like people I know might die today or tomorrow or in 30 years or whatever. And like once you get kind of over that, like you can go down the hallway of it's just fear taking over you all the time, or you can go down the hallway of like, yes, I accept it and this is okay and I'm going to live my life. And if anything, I think the idea of the death positive movement is like, well, okay, how do I want to live my life then? Because I can either be really scared about it or completely ignore it, or I can just live my life. I only have this life that I know of for right now. I might as well take advantage of it and, do a very cool storytelling podcast or be a cemetery TikToker, whatever makes us happy, rather than I'm just, I think also the pandemic for me, I was a lot more death aware because I think we were all talking about like our loved ones might die. And I think I felt very similar of like, I'm not really thinking about my death in the sense of like, how am I going to go out? Like, it's more of like, well, what will my husband feel about this? And what's he going to do? And what will my siblings do? And like, yeah, it's so, I don't know. The brain is so interesting like that. That's crazy.
And you mentioned earlier that your folks gave ghost tours, and you've mentioned several times that you have this affinity for cemeteries, of course. Was that because your folks gave ghost tours that you have this interest in cemeteries, or is this just like innate? You've just always been interested in them?
I think I've always been interested in them. I find them really peaceful places. When I was in high school, I would walk through a cemetery on my way home. Just that was the shortcut, was through a cemetery. And it's fun to like read through names and see different like funny quotes or inside jokes or people's photos and art. And there's just so many things on different gravestones that I find like endlessly interesting. It's like a little piece of each person. And if you walk through a cemetery in the Midwest, the cemeteries in the Midwest are like everything, like, someone's fishing boat might be on it, or like a photo of their favorite beer can, or like literally anything could be on a gravestone. So I just, yeah, I don't know. I really have always liked them. But I'd say more recently, I've been learning of like, what's cemetery preservation like, and what is it like to bring the community in, and what's the history of American cemeteries, and all of the, extra pieces to it other than just the vibe.
So do you plan to put a recipe on your gravestone?
I feel like I have to at this point.
have to.
I have to, yeah. Are you like, do you and your wife talked about doing a cemetery as well, or gravestones?
The thing is that could be a topic of discussion.
Totally.
That is on limits for us. We have not
Absolutely.
had it.
It's one of those things of like, you don't usually deal with it until you have to deal with it. I feel like because of, what I do with TikTok and with cemeteries, and I love cemeteries.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a exciting topic. So I'm working with Congressional Cemetery where I interned. And I am getting a plot there with my husband, and we're talking about like, do we want to be cremated? Do we want this type of burial space? Do we want our ashes scared? Because you can buy a plot and just have a memorial, but not have your body there. There's new things in death studies these days. Aquamation is the new cremation, where you essentially are. It's the same result at the end of you just have some like organic materials. But it's just through water. Your body is run through water for like a month, and then you turn into this material. Versus cremation is just, you're fired up, and in a matter of minutes, basically, you turn into the material. So aquamation's an option. You can get your body turned into gemstones, so your family could have jewelry of you. You can get your body shot into space. You can get your body turned into a body farm or donated to science. There's these things called mushroom pods now, which I'm still learning if that's like how legit that is. But it sounds interesting of like, you put this body into a suit, and then it sprouts like new organic materials, and it's very circle of life kind of thing. And I think for me, some of the things that I care about is like, I want people to miss me when I'm gone. I want to be mourned, but then I kind of want people to move on with their lives. Like I would much prefer, slowly fading into the distance over time. I guess I'm balancing at one point of like, oh, it's important to remember people's names, but also like, even cemeteries won't be around for forever. Like the American cemetery is unusual as a model that we die and are buried there. And given this expectation that you will be taken care of for forever, but for forever means, it can mean anything. And a cemetery could be relocated. Yep. The gravestones could be lost. This happens all the time. And in particular, so I went to, my sister-in-law's Peruvian. I went to Peru a little while ago, and it's, you rent a space. And apparently in Europe, there's different models of it as well. But in a lot of different countries, you rent a space. And then if your family is not around every 5 years to pay for it, a new person comes in and you're just cleaned out, and
wow.
that's that. But outside of that, yeah, most people, you won't be remembered much beyond a generation or two, and that's okay. It feels like engaging with it a little bit more makes it a little less scary. Not that I know what's going to happen afterwards, but yeah, I don't know.
What do you think happens when you die?
I don't know. I feel like I listen to a lot of paranormal podcasts for this reason. And I still am I was raised Catholic, so I'm probably some sort of amalgamation of I'm no longer Catholic anymore, but I feel like that gave me the sense of a soul. And I like the idea that a soul continues on. I don't know what that is or that means. And I think of I think my family is very Pascalian wager of well, you either know or you don't know, but it's nice to believe in something. So I think for us, it's it doesn't hurt me to believe that we'll live on in some way afterwards, whether it's a second life or we just become particles and my dust scatters in the wind. And there's something very pleasant about that too. What do you believe?
I don't know. In a way, I forget who said this to me in my life. It was a family member. I think it was my dad. I was talking about death, or death had come up, and it was well, do you feel bad or do you feel sad about the time before you were born?
Whoa.
And I'm no, it doesn't exist for me. And they're yeah, that's probably how death is.
Wow.
And I don't know if that's supposed to be a good or bad thing. And that's also a very intense way of viewing it.
But also, yeah, there's a sense of why put meaning to it if it is what it is kind of thing. I think if that is what happens at the end, I feel very non-emotionally attached to that. Again, I think for me, in my day-to-day or even in the work that I do, I like to think that there is something else. I don't know what it is. It's not that I even necessarily am a heaven and hell person, but I'm it's nice to believe that there's something and I think about this again, maybe less for myself, but more for my parents and my siblings and my loved ones and my friends, where I'm you know, what are you going to do with the fact that you know like every Taylor Swift song and your cats all have crazy names and like you have this crazy like personal job and this thing and like we have all these memories from our 20s and our like anyways, just like all the micro moments of humanity. I would love to believe gets to continue on somehow, but it might not. It really might just be like at the end.
Yeah, maybe. But I also think that so I studied philosophy in college, and I used to love like thought experiments where the professor presents something that sort of forces the class to take a stance. And I find myself literally constantly, I think about this. When I go to bed, this is a thought I have all the time. Man. I think about like, why does anything exist? And it just keep zooming back. You can have this conversation with anyone. Okay, so here we are, right? Okay, so why are we here? Oh, well, because our parents and their parents and like evolution, or maybe have a religious reason for it. But either way, like that's how we got here. Okay, fine. Okay, well, why is the Earth here? Why does Earth support life? Why does life exist? Why is the sun here? Why is the Milky Way here? And if you're like, oh, it's science. Things just are out there. It's just wrong. It's like, okay, why?
Yeah.
Why? Why does anything exist?
Yeah.
Because it sort of forces you to realize that if there's a reason for everything to exist, we're part of it. So there has to be a reason we're here. Or it's the complete opposite, and we're just like here.
We're just here.
Which is very difficult to grasp.
It is.
But like, what is this within? What is the universe a part of?
Yeah. This is the librarian's child of like, but I want the information.
I know, it's someday.
I really want that information. All the stories that I bet they have. I know, it is really, I mean, that's maybe like, this is a very selfish thing that I do hope there's something else. I think like, I would love to just like, either, you know, I die and I get some sort of like spirit guide who's like, hey, like ask any question. And like, you have infinite access to just what is reality. And I'm like very excited. And I want to be like, well, I want to know everything. Like, I'm so excited if that's the thing. And if that's the case, then, you know, it doesn't really matter either way. But like, I just want to know everything. Mysteries of history. I'm like, I just want to ask all the questions of like, I honestly had never thought to think beyond our planet because there's so many questions I have about our planet that I'm like, oh, will I maybe know that? Like, will I just have, does the universe just become this like, you know, interconnected soul? Like, I guess this is a very Carl Jung way of thinking about it of like, it's just like one body of universe. And that's why we have archetypes, because it's just like a shared consciousness and we just go back to that afterwards. But then you know everything. So I love the idea of that. That would be very cool. But who knows?
Yeah.
You might not. I don't know.
So what would you say is something that you've learned explicitly from doing what you do? Like, what's one thing you've learned?
How to make a good chocolate chip cookie.
Very practical.
Yeah, but I would also say, like, I think we celebrate death, and death traditions can change so much. Like, I think for me, I grew up with, like, food and death were very disconnected. A comment that I get quite often on TikTok is like, ew, you bring food to cemeteries? Like, that's so disgusting. But also, like, in the early days, food, you know, people would picnic in cemeteries. We have tabletop gravestones. And the first American national park was the cemetery before we had official national parks. So, and yeah, people would just picnic on them on the weekends. Cool. And you would be like picnicking with grandpa or someone else's relatives. And it was so normal. And nowadays we have like, yeah, like I get some very strange comments of people being like, they're going to haunt you, or like, that's so disrespectful. And I was like, well, technically from the way that we're taught of like how to behave in cemeteries, in some cases, like I would have assumed that originally. But like now that I've learned the history of cemeteries and even just how other cultures do different food and death traditions. So in any case, it's just, I've learned a lot about like how people use food to remember someone. Even if, like, for me, I grew up with being, like, it was a little bit more taboo, I guess. I guess everything is taboo.
Catholic, you know.
Lots of guilt. Yeah. What did you grow up as?
I was Unitarian Universalist.
Very nice.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I don't know. It was very open-minded.
Yeah, well,
it was sort of like you believe what you want.
You do you.
It was great.
I love that. No, that's so rad. And I wish we'd probably all benefit for being a little bit more like that. Catholics were very fire and brimstone. I do love a Catholic cemetery. They have a lot of like, you know, motifs. And I guess when it comes to like death, you know, we have like the body and blood of Christ, which is a lot of food and death. You eat this thing. And so there's something, I haven't looked too much into that, but I'm like, it has to be something there of like, death is very associated with the traditions of food. We have meals together. You know, I'm Irish. And so like We have the Irish wake where we gather around a casket of the person who just passed away and we're drinking around them. And
That's cool.
You know what I mean? Like that's, I don't know. So,
A lot of tradition around death.
oh, for sure.
There's like much more than I think we realize.
I
Across
think
cultures
so.
and food is a big part of it.
Exactly. Does your family have any particular funerary traditions that you all do?
No,
Yeah.
no. But I feel like we need to get into this death positive movement. and
Hell
start
yeah.
thinking about it, you
That's
know?
great. Do you mind if I ask the last funeral that you went to?
My aunt.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, she died in 2012.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, it was, she was the first person I watched die.
Wow.
So she had breast cancer. She, Andy, it
Mm.
was crazy. She was like fine. She was 45.
Oh my gosh.
And
so
she
young.
went home. She was living in Seattle with her twin boys and her husband, Matt. And she just went back in for pneumonia. And it actually really was sort of not a big deal.
Oh
And
my goodness.
I was out in San Diego for military training, and my family was like, "Hey, Andy's going back in the hospital," but it's really just sort of an overabundance of precaution here because she
Yeah.
has cancer. But it just spiraled, and then before long, I was flying to Seattle,
Oh my
and
goodness.
Andy's like so full of life.
Yeah.
And I walked into the hospital, and I know she's gonna die. It's very clear. And her husband's there, and he's sort of in shock, and my dad and his brother, so her brother, and I went and just held her hand.
Wow.
And in a way, because I was the nephew, and I was definitely close with her, but like my father and his brother and her husband, they're there, but this is so deep cutting. It's almost like they can't quite be here in the moment. And I sort of almost intuitively recognized that, like, I'm just going to be super close to Andy because she's here still.
Yeah.
She seems to know we're in the room with her, but she's doing like the death rattle. It's like the
Yeah.
end of her life. And I held her hand and I was like, it's okay. Like, you can go. Yeah. And then watching her die,
Wow.
it's like, it was profound and beautiful and fucking devastating,
Yeah. What a gift that you gave to her, though, of being there with her. I mean, I feel like people do full death doula trainings literally just to sit next to someone while they're there. Because there's something, I heard a peacekeeper, someone who like worked as a peacekeeper saying something like this, and maybe you are this type of person of like, you're either two types of people in life. You're the person who is stopping people from jumping off of the cliff, and like it's very preventative. It's maybe more at a distance, or you're the person at the bottom of the cliff working with people who have fallen off of the cliff, and it's very like face to face. And I feel like people who do grief workers, death doulas, who can just sit at the bedside are the people at the bottom of the cliff who are like, things went on beforehand that are out of my control, but I'm with you now, and like I can be here. And a lot of times you can't be one or the other. I think some people can do both. I think I'm more of a top of the cliff person, but maybe you're a bottom of the cliff person.
Yeah, I mean, the other side to this, truthfully, is, and I haven't talked about this, but like, so the Andy's death, that's like my family, and it was, it was really difficult. It still is. But then when I was deployed overseas, I saw death in a very different way.
Yeah.
I mean, candidly, I was a Navy SEAL, and like, we're going out, effectively with the intent to do harm.
Yeah.
I mean, no matter how you want to cut it, it's no matter how you feel about it, that's what
Active
it was.
duty, yeah.
And I remember like one of the first times that it wasn't me, but somebody on our team took somebody else's life, and I had to. It's called Seek. There's a machine you use to fingerprint people.
Oh, wow.
It's an archive of all the people. And this, for the record, the person we took out, like, they actively shot at us.
Yeah.
It isn't like it was whoops, we got it wrong.
Well, this is kind of how it is, yeah.
Right. And again, like, people can make the claim that we shouldn't have been in the first place, whatever.
Sure.
But I remember I was fingerprinting him, and he was dead. And the sun had just come up, and we're in his compound, in his house. And I had this really difficult sort of realization that, like, if the roles were somehow reversed, and like I'm in my home in the United States, like, would I take up arms against a foreign country that had come into my country? Probably. I probably would. And he had family, I'm sure. They were fine. But I'm like fingerprinting him, and he's just been killed.
Wow.
So he's like fully looks alive, minus gunshots. And I like had to tell myself that this was different than Andy. Like, this is,
wow, that like came through your head while.
because there was like empathy, even though like there's no more
course.
gunfighting, like there's nothing happening now. We are at the full, like, it's over and done with, and we're just processing the scene. And it's very professional. Like the post
Yeah.
Contact is very professional. We all just do our jobs, and mine was just fingerprint. And I couldn't help but have that sense of humanity of like feeling bad, even though I'm not kidding. I walked into a hallway and I went up a stairwell before he was shot, and my teammate came right behind me, and the guy was laying in wait and shot a shotgun that hit my teammate right in the chest, and it turned into this whole thing. So it was like this horrible thing.
Yeah, yeah.
He lived. But yeah, like I think that I left Afghanistan, especially with my own brush with death, and even that and several other people that I seek.
Yeah.
It's hard not to feel that humanity, even in the worst of places, and in a situation where you've sort of you've almost been told to look at them not at like, they're not like Andy. They're not like Andy. They're different. The same way they look at me is different.
Yeah.
But we're all just like bags of blood and bone trying to make sense of the world.
Suits, yeah.
It's difficult to grapple with.
I think like that's a good thing though. I mean, it's because I'm imagining it would be really difficult to hold on to like a sense of humanity and to be able to, do your job. I don't know. I think that's really, there's something really like, there's a spark there of the fact that you got to experience that basically it almost sounded like your aunt was there with you while you were experiencing that. Like, I don't know. These are things like that make me believe in a soul.
I think that's fair. I think it does. I think that there's also, it's such a big part of human experience
Totally.
to imagine that there's some element that is a soul.
Yeah.
Why does religion exist to begin with? Because everybody over humanity has thought about it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like one day we said, I think religion's a thing.
Yeah.
Like for the sake, like all of time, it seems like there's been some idea that there's a higher power of some kind.
Totally. And like,
I hope there is.
I hope there is. And like, whatever it looks like, I'm so down for whatever tradition it turns into. But like, it's nice to think about these things. And then like, I feel like, what an extreme scenario of like you're seeking and your aunt is there on some level with you, whether it's just like presence of mind. And I think like, this is like such a tangent, but I swear this is just reminding me. Have you ever seen a psychic before?
I think, but only as a child, and it was sort of ad hoc, and it was not serious.
Totally. Well, I know you saw a mentalist in a previous episode,
yes.
and that also, I'm still curious. Like, there's so many, there's a lot to unpack with that. But I saw there's a psychic in LA, and I should say, like, I love paranormal stories. I love ghost stories. I think to me, it's like my like very soft level of engaging in these like higher topics, but. But I saw her and she asked me to pull up my phone and voice record us during the whole thing. And then she immediately starts talking about my friend in college who died, who took her own life. And she's like, she's really worried about you. And I'd been going through, when I first moved to LA, so this was maybe about 2 years ago that this happened. First moved to LA, very homesick. I'm from Virginia myself. And I was like, I miss home and I miss my family and I feel very fish out of water and what am I doing here? And the TikTok was doing great, but I think I personally was just really struggling. And I was thinking about my friend a lot who had taken her own life. And I was just like, I don't know, like she was just like, I just was almost disconnected, but I was just thinking about her all the time. And I go see the psychic and the psychic is like, yeah, your friend Emily's really worried about you. And I was like, what? Like, only my partner I've talked to about this. Like, and she's like, yeah, like the one who was probably going to be a teacher. And I was like, yeah, no, I know this, who my friend, like, yes, she was going to be a teacher. That's crazy. And she's like, yeah, like you need to start doing things for yourself a lot more. You need to start prioritizing a little bit more. And honestly, it was really crazy to have that confirmation because like my friend during some of these like just very dark moments where I'd like wake up crying and I'd fall asleep crying because I'm like, I just miss my family. Like, what am I doing in LA? This is awful. And like just a lot of like dark thoughts. And like with those dark thoughts, my friend would be there with me. So it was so crazy to have like a year of this, of my friend just always suddenly being there with me, like in my mind. And then an external person would be like, yeah, no, she's with you. She's like, and I will say like, things have gotten much better. I actually really like my life in LA. My partner and I have like, we moved to a neighborhood that made things so much better. And my friend is less present of mine now that I'm in a good place. Yeah. And I can't help but wonder if like I was being, I don't know, sensing her or something like that, but it was a very strange synchronicity that I keep thinking about with, I don't know. Again,
it's powerful.
Soul, who knows? Something's there. I don't know.
So obviously you have this incredible book that has just come out, To Die For, a cookbook of gravestone recipes. It's more than just a recipe book. There's stories in here, amazing pictures. You should be very proud of this. It's beautiful. This is incredible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is such an honor to be here.
Right on.
Thank you.
Thank you.